There is a city that once believed it would last forever. Wide boulevards lined with stone and steel. Government buildings so massive they seem to have grown from the earth itself rather than been built upon it. A capital that had absorbed the energy of an entire continent, its stolen art, its conscripted labor, its broken economies, and worn it all like a crown. For 12 years, the machinery of the Third Reich had hummed from the heart of this city, sending its orders outward across Europe, like signals from a transmitter that could never be switched off. Berlin, in the spring of 1945, was that transmitter, and the world was about to silence it. But this story is not simply about a military operation. It is not simply about armies, or artillery barrages, or the square kilometers of rubble that would be left when it was over. This is the story of what happens when an ideology built on the idea of permanent dominance meets the arithmetic of reality. When the promises made to a population, promises of safety, of supremacy, of a future that belonged to them alone, dissolve in the smoke of a city burning from every direction at once. This is the story of the fall of Berlin, and it begins not with a gunshot, or a surrender, or a flag raised over a shattered building. It begins with a question that more than 2 million ordinary people were asking themselves in the early months of 1945. How did it come to this? Settle in. This is a long one, and it deserves your full attention, even if your eyes are closing as you listen. Because the fall of Berlin is not a simple story. There is no clean arc here, no tidy moment where good defeated evil and the world exhaled. What happened in Berlin between January and May of 1945 was one of the largest, most destructive urban military operations in the history of human conflict. More than 2 million Soviet soldiers converged on a single city. The defensive force assembled to stop them included men in their 50s and boys who had not yet finished school. The woman sheltering in a cellar on the Unter den Linden had no more say in any of it than the soldier 50 meters away who was trying to kill the man trying to kill him. This documentary will take you through the complete history of that siege, from the days when Berlin still functioned as a capital, when its cafes still served coffee and its cinemas still showed films, all the way through to the rubble, the silence, and the slow, terrible process of reckoning with what had been done and what had been lost. We will trace the Soviet advance from the Vistula River to the Oder, from the Oder to the suburbs, and from the suburbs into the burning core of the city itself. We will follow the collapse of German command from the grand strategic level, the decisions made by exhausted generals trying to navigate the gap between military reality and Adolf Hitler's refusal to accept it, all the way down to the street level, where individual soldiers and civilians made choices about survival that no military history textbook can fully capture. We will spend time in the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, where the man responsible for all of this retreated into a world of maps and phantom armies, while the city above him was destroyed. And we will spend time in the cellars above, where families packed together in the dark, listening to the artillery get closer, passing water and fear between them in equal measure. If you are new here, welcome. Take a moment to get comfortable, dim the lights, find your position, let the weight of the day begin to lift. This channel exists to take you through history at the pace history deserves, not in 5-minute summaries or highlight reels, but in the full, breathing, complicated detail of what actually happened and why it mattered. If this is the kind of documentary experience you have been looking for, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. There is a great deal more where this is coming from, and every video is built with exactly this kind of night in mind. Now, back to Berlin. The thing that is so difficult to grasp about this city in 1945, the thing that makes the story both tragic and infuriating in equal measure, is that so much of what was coming had been visible for so long. The German military had been fighting a losing war on the Eastern Front since the winter of 1941. The defeats at Moscow, at Stalingrad, at Kursk, each one of them had been a signal, clear as a flare in the dark. The Reich was overextended, undersupplied, and fighting against a Soviet military machine that had learned from its early catastrophes and had not forgotten a single lesson. By the time the year 1945 began, the writing was not on the wall. It was on every wall. It was in the casualty reports and the supply shortages and the desperate orders being sent to units that no longer had the men or the equipment to carry them out. Germany's allies had fallen away. Its air force had been ground down to a fraction of what it once was. Its cities were being bombed around the clock by British and American aircraft, operating with near impunity. And to the east, a Soviet force of staggering size was massing for the final push. And still, Berlin waited. Not because its people were eager for what was coming. The letters sent home from soldiers, the diaries kept by civilians, the accounts gathered after the war. They all tell the same story of a population that had long since moved beyond belief in victory and was now simply trying to navigate from one day to the next. But the machinery of the Nazi state had been designed, above all else, to prevent the kind of organized resistance that might have forced an earlier end. Surrender was not a word the regime permitted. Defeatism was punishable by death, and not theoretically. In the final months of the war, men were hanged from lampposts in German cities with signs around their necks, reading that they had failed the fatherland. The fear of the regime did not stop at the front line. It extended all the way back into the living rooms and cellars of its own capital. This is what made Berlin different from every other city that had fallen in this war. Paris had been declared an open city to save it. Rome had been surrendered before it could be destroyed. But Berlin was going to be fought for, building by building, floor by floor, room by room, because the man in the bunker beneath the chancellery had decided that if the Reich was to die, it would die without concession. What followed was one of the most devastating urban battles in history, and the city that had once sent its armies out to remake the world was about to have the world come back to remake it. 18 chapters, the complete history, from the capital that believed itself untouchable to the rubble that proved it was not. It starts with the city itself, what Berlin was, what it meant, and what it was about to lose. Close your eyes if you want to. The story will carry you the rest of the way. There is a city that sits at the heart of a continent, and for 12 years it wore its power like armor. Berlin, in the early months of 1945, was not merely a capital. It was a statement, a built argument, rendered in stone and steel and wide, deliberate avenues, that the men who controlled it were destined to control everything else. The boulevards ran straight and broad, designed not for the convenience of citizens, but for the spectacle of power, for torchlit columns of soldiers marching in lockstep beneath flags that stretched from rooftop to rooftop. The Unter den Linden stretched westward toward the Brandenburg Gate with the quiet confidence of an empire that had decided, some years earlier, that history belonged to it. Every building along that axis seemed to lean slightly inward, as though conferring, as though the architecture itself was in on the plan. To understand what was about to happen to Berlin, you must first understand what Berlin believed itself to be. By 1945, it was a city of roughly 4 million people, swollen beyond its peacetime size by the machinery of war, by ministries, by bureaucracies, by the endless administrative apparatus of occupation and conquest. The Reich Chancellery sat at its symbolic center, rebuilt and expanded just before the war to dimensions that bordered on the theatrical. The great hall inside was longer than was strictly necessary for any meeting. The ceilings climbed higher than any natural conversation required. Albert Speer, the architect who conceived it, later admitted that it was designed to make visitors feel small. That was the intention. That was always the intention. The city spread outward from that center in rings, each defined by its function and its relationship to the regime. The government quarter occupied a dense cluster south and west of the Tiergarten, that broad park at the city's heart, which had itself been planted with vegetable gardens by the time the war entered its final phase, a quiet, telling detail. Where ornamental trees had once lined decorative paths, Berliners now grew potatoes and beets. The city was adapting, as cities do, bending its habits toward survival, even while its official posture remained one of unshakable confidence. The trams still ran in early 1945. The post still delivered letters. Department stores on the Kurfürstendamm still displayed window arrangements, even as the windows themselves had been taped against blast damage. Berlin maintained its routines with the particular stubbornness of a place that refuses to believe its own situation. To the east, the city gave way to flat industrial suburbs, Treptow, Köpenick, the factory districts that had fed the Reich's appetite for armaments since the late 1930s. These were the neighborhoods where workers had once voted in large numbers against the party that now directed their labor, and where, by 1945, the workforce had been supplemented by forced laborers from across occupied Europe. To the west, the city softened into wealthier residential districts, villas set behind stone walls, the kinds of neighborhoods whose residents had benefited most conspicuously from the regime and would be least inclined to question the optimistic bulletins still appearing in the press. To the north and south, Berlin blended into the forests and lakes of the Brandenburg countryside, a geography that would soon matter enormously to the soldiers tasked with defending it. Berlin had been bombed before 1945, had been bombed heavily and repeatedly. The Royal Air Force had come at night, the American 8th Air Force by day, and between them they had reduced significant portions of the city to rubble well before the Soviet armies reached the Oder River. Entire residential blocks in the inner districts had been gutted, their facades standing while the interiors collapsed into themselves. The bombing had not broken the city's will. It is a persistent myth that strategic bombing alone breaks civilian morale. But it had remade the texture of daily life in ways that were impossible to ignore. Families moved into basements. Office workers commuted past mountains of rubble that had been cleared to the sides of the road and left there, grey and patient, like geological features of a new and unwelcome landscape. The smell of old fires had seeped into everything. What is striking, in retrospect, is how much of the city continued to function. The propaganda ministry under Joseph Goebbels maintained its output with extraordinary discipline, producing newsreels and radio bulletins that described German military operations in the language of strategic withdrawal rather than collapse. Newspapers still appeared, though on reduced paper rations, their headlines carefully curated to manage the emotional temperature of a population that was beginning, quietly and in private, to draw its own conclusions. A city that loses faith in its government rarely announces the fact openly. It announces it in whispers, in the slight hesitation before a mandatory greeting, in the small practical preparations, a bag kept packed, a little food hoarded, a route out of the city quietly identified, that people make when they sense the official story is no longer quite adequate. The Reich had conquered most of Europe by the early 1940s, and Berlin had felt that conquest as a kind of confirmation. There had been parades down those broad avenues, triumphant returns from France, from the Balkans, from North Africa, and the crowds that lined the streets had been large and genuinely enthusiastic, at least in the early years. The city had grown accustomed to the idea that it stood at the center of something vast and permanent. The grievances of the 1920s, the hunger, the humiliation, the economic catastrophe, had been replaced, in the experience of many Berliners, by something that felt like restored dignity, even if the price of that restoration had been paid by people elsewhere, in ways that most Berliners preferred not to examine too closely. By 1945, that bargain was presenting its bill. The population that remained in Berlin in the winter and early spring of 1945 was not the same population that had celebrated in the streets some years before. Hundreds of thousands of Berliners had left the city, either through official evacuation programs that had moved children and mothers to the countryside, or through private arrangements made by those with the means and the connections to go. Those who remained were, in the main, those who could not leave, the elderly, the poor, workers bound to essential industries, and a substantial number of people who simply could not bring themselves to abandon the only place they had ever lived. Alongside them remained the party faithful, the SS garrison, the administrative machinery of a state that was still, technically, at war, and still, technically governing. The defences of Berlin had been planned in concentric rings. The outermost ring extended far into the surrounding countryside, intended to absorb the first shock of any attacking force before it could reach the city proper. Inside that lay a series of intermediate positions, and inside those lay the inner ring, running along the line of the city's main railway infrastructure. At the very centre, the government district itself was designated a separate defensive zone, the citadel, the final redoubt, the place where, in the imagination of those who drew the plans, a last stand might be made. On paper, these rings suggested an organized and layered resistance. In practice, they were being built by men who were too old, too young, or too exhausted to build them properly, using materials that were insufficient for the purpose and under the direction of a command structure already beginning to fracture under the pressure of conflicting orders from above. The men and women preparing those defenses knew, in that unspoken way that soldiers and civilians develop in the late stages of a losing war, that the rings would not hold. They built anyway. They dug anti-tank ditches into the frozen ground of the eastern suburbs. They constructed barricades from rubble and overturned trams. They bolted steel obstacles to the junctions of major streets. The physical act of preparation provided its own form of psychological comfort, the reassurance of doing something, of converting fear into labor. It was not so different, really, from the people taping their windows against blast, a gesture somewhere between practical measure and prayer. And Berlin itself, this city of stone and memory and long, straight boulevards built for triumph, waited. The trams ran, the post arrived. The newspapers appeared with their carefully arranged headlines. Children who had been taught since birth that they belonged to a people chosen by history for greatness now helped their mothers carry water from street pumps because the mains had been damaged in the bombing and the water pressure was unreliable. Old men in uniforms several sizes too large for their diminished frames stood at street corners and checked papers with an authority that was becoming, daily, more obviously ceremonial. The cafes on the Kurfürstendamm were still open, though the menus had contracted considerably, and the conversations inside them had taken on that particular careful quality of people who are aware that other people might be listening. Somewhere to the east, across the flat plains of Poland, across the frozen tributaries of rivers, whose names most Berliners could barely pronounce. Something was moving toward them. It had been moving for months. It was vast, and it was angry, and it had covered enormous distances already, and showed no sign of stopping. Berlin stood where it had always stood, at the center of the continent it had tried to own, and the ground beneath it was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to tremble. The ground was frozen solid across the width of Poland in January 1945, and that was precisely how the Soviet commanders wanted it. Mud had plagued their operations before, churning roads into impassable rivers, swallowing tanks whole, grinding offensives to a halt with nothing more than geography and rain. But frost made the earth hard and reliable underfoot, and the Red Army had learned, through years of catastrophic defeat followed by patient rebuilding, to read the seasons as strategic instruments. When the temperature dropped far enough to lock the land in place, heavy armor could move fast and move wide. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commanding the First Belarusian Front, had spent months watching that thermometer, stockpiling fuel and ammunition along the Vistula River, waiting for exactly this window. When it came, he did not hesitate. He had not survived the war by hesitating. The offensive that launched in the middle of January 1945 was not one thrust, but many. A coordinated series of hammer blows aimed simultaneously at multiple points along a vast front stretching from the Baltic coast southward through central Poland. Zhukov's forces drove directly westward toward the German heartland, while Marshal Ivan Koniev's First Ukrainian Front pushed north and west through Silesia, and other Soviet fronts swept through the north and south. The effect was overwhelming by design. German commanders could not pull reserves from one sector to reinforce another without exposing a third. Every defensive line that stiffened in one place was being flanked somewhere else. This was the doctrine of deep battle operations. Not a single punch, but a sustained barrage across the entire body, designed to prevent any recovery. The Wehrmacht, already bled white from years of fighting across half a continent, had no answer for it. The scale of Soviet force assembled for this operation was almost beyond comprehension. More than 2 million troops had been staged along the Vistula line. Behind them stretched supply columns of staggering length, tens of thousands of trucks, horse-drawn wagons, fuel depots, field hospitals, and artillery parks that together formed a moving industrial city. Soviet tank armies numbered their vehicles in the thousands, supported by self-propelled guns, mobile rocket batteries, and close air support. The men who drove and marched and fought within this machine came from every corner of the Soviet Union. Siberian rifle divisions hardened by years at the front, Cossack cavalry adapted for speed and penetration, engineering units capable of throwing a bridge across a river in hours. They had reached this moment through suffering that would be difficult to describe. They had watched their country burn in 1941 and 1942. They were not in a forgiving mood. Against this force, the Germans defending Army Group Center and Army Group A were outnumbered at almost every point. In some sectors, the ratio of attackers to defenders reached 5-1 in infantry, and far higher in tanks and artillery. German commanders knew the attack was coming, the intelligence was unmistakable, the build-up too large to conceal, but knowing something is coming and having the means to stop it are entirely different problems. Requests for reinforcements had gone to Berlin for months and had returned as vague reassurances or outright denials. The divisions holding the Vistula line were under strength, low on fuel, and short of the anti-tank weapons they desperately needed. When the Soviet artillery opened up on that January morning, the bombardment that followed was so concentrated that entire command networks simply ceased to exist. Telephone lines melted away, bunkers collapsed, and men who had survived years of war were simply erased. The Soviet advance moved at a pace that stunned even those conducting it. Within days, columns of Soviet armor had punched through the crust of the German front and were driving into the operational depth behind, moving faster than defenders could retreat. The pace mattered enormously because a retreating force given time and distance can reorganize, dig in, and present a new front. Speed denied them that chance. Soviet tank commanders received orders to bypass pockets of resistance rather than fight for every position, trusting that infantry following behind would contain or eliminate holdouts. The result was a rolling penetration that opened up the geography of Poland like a door swinging wide. Towns and cities that had been under German occupation for more than 5 years suddenly found themselves in the path of a Soviet column moving west at a pace no one had anticipated. The city of Warsaw had already fallen by the middle of January. What remained of it, after years of brutal occupation and the catastrophic destruction of the uprising the previous summer, was liberated. Though liberated is perhaps too clean a word for what Soviet forces found. The city had been systematically demolished by German engineers following the failed uprising, block by block, building by building, in an act of deliberate annihilation. Soviet soldiers advancing through what had been one of Europe's great capitals walked through kilometers of rubble. There were almost no inhabitants left. The contrast between the city that had existed and the field of ruins they were crossing through gave many soldiers a particular kind of fury, a clarity about what they were fighting and why. Warsaw did not slow them down, it hardened their purpose. Zhukov drove his commanders relentlessly. He was not a gentle man, and had never pretended to be. He demanded speed above almost everything else, understanding that strategic momentum is fragile. It can be lost to hesitation as easily as to enemy fire. His army groups advanced roughly 500 kilometers in less than 3 weeks, an operational achievement that military historians would study for decades. Logistics officers sweated through the nights, keeping fuel and ammunition flowing up roads that were themselves advancing into newly captured territory. Breakdowns, ambushes, and the endless friction of war in a foreign country all worked against the schedule, but the pace held. German rear area commanders, who had expected weeks to organize their defenses, suddenly found Soviet tank columns in their towns before their own troops had arrived. As Soviet forces crossed into German territory proper, into the province of Silesia in the south, and into Pomerania and Brandenburg in the north, the nature of the advance began to change in atmosphere, if not in speed. This was no longer liberated territory. This was the enemy's homeland, and the Soviet soldiers who poured into it carried with them years of accumulated grief and anger. The German civilian population that had not fled found itself in a situation with no precedent in their experience. The propaganda they had been fed for years had described the Soviet soldier as a barely human instrument of destruction. Some of that propaganda's predictions were borne out in the violence that followed. Much of the suffering inflicted on German civilians in those weeks was real, and it was severe, and it stands as a dark counterpart to the military achievement surrounding it. The German High Command struggled to construct a coherent defensive response. New defensive lines were announced, manned with whatever could be scraped together from training battalions, convalescent soldiers, and reserves pulled from other theatres. Some of these positions held for days before being outflanked or overrun. Others simply dissolved when the sheer weight of Soviet forces made themselves felt. The Oder River was identified as the last major natural barrier before Berlin, roughly 80 kilometers east of the capital, and there were genuine efforts to fortify its western bank. But German forces arrived at the Oder already shattered, disorganized, and low on everything they needed to mount a serious resistance. What greeted Soviet reconnaissance units when they reached the Oder in late January and early February was a line that existed more on maps than on the ground. News of the Soviet advance reached Berlin in fragments, filtered through official channels that minimized and delayed unfavorable reports. The Nazi propaganda apparatus had perfected the art of softening disaster into temporary setback, of wrapping retreat in the language of strategic adjustment. But the population of Berlin was not entirely deceived. The arrival of refugees told a different story. People streaming in from the east, carrying what they could, hollow-eyed and exhausted, bearing witness to a collapse that no official statement could adequately explain away. Long queues formed outside train stations as those with connections or resources attempted to send their families westward. Others began quietly stockpiling food in cellars. The fear was real and growing, pressing in from the east like the cold front that had enabled the offensive in the first place. For the Soviet soldier pushing toward Berlin through these weeks, the experience was one of overwhelming forward motion interrupted by brief, violent spasms of German resistance. Pockets of Wehrmacht troops fought with genuine ferocity in places, extracting a serious price in lives before being overwhelmed or bypassed. The cost of the Vistula-Oder campaign was not small. Soviet casualties ran into hundreds of thousands across the entire front. But the operation succeeded in what it set out to do with a completeness that left the German strategic position in a state approaching irreversibility. By the time Soviet forces consolidated their bridgeheads across the Oder, the distance between the Red Army and Adolf Hitler's desk in the Chancellery could be measured in a modest drive by car. The calculations of military distance had collapsed into something closer to a countdown. What the January offensive had demonstrated, more clearly than anything else, was that the accumulated strength of the Soviet Union had finally been brought to bear in a single sustained application of force. Years of production, years of training, years of learning the brutal lessons of modern mechanized warfare. All of it converged on this frozen strip of European plain and swept through it. The Red Army that had once retreated in chaos before Wehrmacht advances had been remade into something formidable, patient, and experienced in ways that could not be easily countered. Berlin lay at the far end of that westward momentum. The machinery was already in motion. The only question remaining was not whether Soviet forces would arrive at the German capital, but what they would find when they got there, and what they would have to do to take it. By the winter of 1945, the geography of defeat was written plainly on every operational map inside the German High Command. Soviet armies had torn through Poland, crossed rivers that German planners had once considered natural barriers, and were grinding westward with a momentum that no reserve force could arrest. The distance between the Eastern Front and Berlin was no longer a comfortable abstraction. It was measured in days. And yet, within the highest levels of the Nazi leadership, there was a man who looked at those same maps and saw something different. Not catastrophe, not evidence demanding retreat. He saw a situation that, with the right orders issued to the right commanders, could still be reversed. That man was Adolf Hitler, and his certainty, absolute, sealed against correction, impervious to the counsel of every officer who served him, would condemn the city of Berlin and everyone in it to a fate that could have been avoided. Surrender, in Hitler's universe of thought, was not a military option. It was a moral failing, a form of cowardice so fundamental that to entertain it meant you had already betrayed the cause. He had built his entire political identity on the belief that will, pure and unrelenting, could overcome material disadvantage. The failure of Germany in the First World War, as he had long preached, had not been a failure of arms. It had been a failure of nerve. He would not repeat that weakness. He would not allow those around him to repeat it either. So when senior officers approached him with assessments that concluded the war in the East was militarily unwinnable, they were not met with consideration. They were met with fury, with accusations of defeatism, or they were simply removed and replaced with men who would tell him what he wished to hear. The chain of command did not flow downward from reality through Hitler. It flowed downward from Hitler's will, and reality was expected to comply. This dynamic had real and terrible consequences for the planning sessions that took place in the weeks before the Soviet assault reached German soil. Officers who had spent years on the Eastern Front and understood the Red Army's capacity for sustained offensive operations were sidelined. In their place, Hitler surrounded himself with aides and adjutants who framed their briefings carefully, who softened numbers, who learned to present bad news wrapped inside thin optimism. The Führer's conferences, held daily, became exercises in collaborative fiction. Divisions were discussed as if they were at full strength when their actual rosters were a fraction of what the maps suggested. Counterattack plans were drawn up against Soviet formations that outnumbered the forces assigned to stop them by ratios that made the outcomes mathematically predetermined. No one at the table said so out loud, because saying so out loud had consequences. The faith in what military men quietly called miracle weapons was one of the more surreal features of this period. Germany had invested enormous industrial and scientific resources into advanced weapons programs, jet aircraft, new submarine designs, rockets capable of striking distant cities. Some of these systems were real, and some had already been deployed. But by the first months of 1945, the war had advanced so far beyond the point where any single technology could alter its course that the continued belief in them as decisive factors was less a military calculation than a form of psychological shelter. Hitler genuinely appeared to believe that one more prototype, one more deployment, one more production surge would shift the balance. His generals, for the most part, had abandoned that belief, but they attended the briefings, they reviewed the specifications, and they nodded. Beneath these weapons programs ran a deeper delusion, the idea of phantom armies. On German operational maps, formations were marked with their official designations: corps, divisions, army groups, as if those designations corresponded to actual fighting strength in the field. In reality, the army Hitler commanded in his imagination bore only a faint resemblance to the army that existed in the trenches and rubble to the east. Units that had been decimated in fighting across Poland and East Prussia had been rebuilt on paper, given new commanding officers, reassigned to new sectors. But the men to fill those rosters did not exist. Fresh drafts of poorly trained recruits had been folded into exhausted formations. The result was a military structure whose organizational charts looked coherent, but whose actual capacity for sustained combat had been hollowed out. Hitler ordered these formations to hold, to counterattack, to relieve, and they could not, because they were, in the most practical sense, ghosts. The orders that flowed from Hitler's headquarters during this period had a quality of growing abstraction. He would hear a report that a particular defensive line had been broken, and he would respond by ordering a counterattack from a formation that was either already shattered or positioned too far away to arrive in time. When the counterattack failed to materialize, because it never could, the explanation was not that the order had been impossible to execute. The explanation was treachery, incompetence, deliberate failure. Hitler's suspicion of his own officer corps, which had always been present, became in these months a consuming preoccupation. Generals who reported the truth were accused of sabotage. Those who attempted to withdraw forces to more defensible positions without explicit authorization faced courts-martial or execution. The message to every commander in the field was unambiguous. Retreat without permission was a crime punishable by death, and permission would not be given. This had a cascading effect throughout the military hierarchy that accelerated Germany's destruction. Commanders who understood that a position was untenable held it anyway, because the alternative was a firing squad or the gallows. Men who might have preserved their units through tactical withdrawal instead fed them into engagements they could not win. The army was being consumed not only by Soviet firepower, but by the decisions of a man who would not permit his officers to respond to the battlefield as soldiers. Every natural adjustment that a functioning military makes under pressure, the pullback to tighten a line, the trade of ground for time, the conservation of strength for a decisive moment, was denied. The rigid order to hold every position, to yield not 1 meter, turned defensible terrain into death traps. What made this particularly devastating was the way the logic of denial filtered down beyond the officer corps and into the civilian population of Berlin itself. The Nazi propaganda apparatus, which had spent years shaping public perception, was fully committed to the narrative that Germany was still fighting toward a resolution that was not surrender. Newspapers continued to publish. Radio broadcasts continued to project confidence, or at minimum, to frame the military situation in language that obscured its true gravity. Ordinary Berliners, already accustomed to managing the gap between official statements and lived experience, were nonetheless dependent on official communications for basic information about what was coming and when. What they received was managed, delayed, and frequently false. The result was that a city of more than 2 million people entered the final weeks before the Soviet assault without the full understanding of what was about to happen to them, not because they were entirely credulous, but because the information they needed to make decisions had been deliberately withheld. Evacuation offers an especially painful illustration of this failure. As Soviet forces closed on the Oder River and the distance to Berlin shrank to the span of a single determined armoured advance, there was still time, narrow perhaps, but real, for large-scale civilian evacuation from the capital. The roads and rail lines, while under strain, were not yet severed. Movement was still possible, but ordering a mass evacuation of Berlin would have required acknowledging, publicly and plainly, that the city was in direct danger, and that acknowledgement was incompatible with the official posture of confident resistance. Hitler's refusal to evacuate was not, at its root, a logistical decision. It was an ideological one. To empty Berlin of its civilians would have been an admission that the war had reached German soil in a way that could not be managed, and that admission, in Hitler's framework, was itself a form of defeat. So the people stayed. Among the senior figures around Hitler, there were those who understood what the refusal to evacuate meant, not in strategic terms, but in human ones. Some attempted, through indirect means, to prepare the population or to create unofficial channels for flight. But the apparatus of Nazi control, even in its decaying final form, was still capable of enforcement. Unauthorized evacuation orders, unauthorized surrenders, unauthorized retreats. These were all answerable under a system that punished deviation with swift and visible brutality. The intended effect was cohesion, that the fear of German punishment would outweigh the fear of Soviet advance and keep the defense intact. The actual effect was to trap soldiers, civilians, and commanders alike inside a system that no longer served any military purpose, but continued to grind forward on its own internal logic. The men who briefed Hitler in the final operational sessions of March and early April 1945 knew, with varying degrees of clarity, that they were participants in something that had passed beyond the realm of strategy. They were, in their carefully worded updates and their restrained assessments, performing the ritual of a military command structure around a man who no longer inhabited the same operational reality. Some believed in him still, some feared him, some had long since concluded that the outcome was fixed and were simply choosing how they would face it. What united almost all of them was silence. The silence of men who had learned that speaking clearly was dangerous, and who had, through that learned silence, become instruments of the catastrophe they might otherwise have interrupted. In the bunker, and in the briefing rooms above it, 1,000 small suppressions of truth were accumulating into something enormous and irreversible. Berlin did not fall because it could not be defended. It fell, at least in part, because the man who commanded its defense had made rational defense impossible. He had stripped his commanders of the authority to adapt, had fed his armies into positions they could not hold, had denied his civilians the information and time they needed to flee, and had replaced every realistic assessment with a faith in will that the physical world was under no obligation to honor. The city would pay for that faith in rubble and ash and lives. And the tragedy, which would unfold across the weeks that followed, was in many ways already sealed not by the approaching Soviet armies, whose strength was real and whose momentum was overwhelming, but by the decisions made inside German headquarters, where the maps still showed phantom divisions and the orders still promised outcomes that were never coming. By the winter of 1945, the German military that had once swept across an entire continent was a shroud of the force that had launched its war of conquest 6 years before. Divisions that once numbered tens of thousands of men had been ground down to fractions of their original strength. Supply lines that once stretched from the Atlantic coast to the suburbs of Moscow now barely reached from one ruined city to the next. The Wehrmacht had not simply retreated, it had been consumed, battle by battle, winter by winter, until what remained was held together by discipline, fear, and a kind of grim institutional momentum that kept men marching even when the cause was plainly lost. Into this catastrophe, Berlin was expected to hold, and so Germany reached into every corner of its exhausted nation to find the bodies that would stand between the capital and the Soviet advance. What it found was not an army, it was a last scraping of a society eating itself to survive. The formal military backbone of Berlin's defense rested on units that had been battered beyond normal recognition. Wehrmacht infantry divisions that arrived in the city in early 1945 carried their old names and their old flags, but the men filling their ranks bore little resemblance to the professionals who had once trained for years before seeing combat. Replacements came faster than they could be integrated. Equipment was issued incomplete or not at all. Artillery batteries that should have fielded dozens of guns sometimes managed only a handful, supplied with shells rationed so tightly that commanders were expected to calculate whether each round was worth the expenditure. Officers made their plans around men who existed only on paper, filling out rosters with names attached to bodies that had already been buried somewhere east of the Oder. The Wehrmacht still had its regulations, its chain of command, its morning briefings, but the substance that had once given those structures meaning had been largely spent. Alongside the regular army stood the Waffen-SS formations assigned to Berlin's sector, and they were a different creature entirely. These men had been ideologically hardened through years of indoctrination, and, in many cases, years of brutal combat on the Eastern Front. They did not speak of defeat with the same resignation that crossed the faces of exhausted infantry officers. They spoke of holding, of bleeding the enemy white, of dying in the ruins rather than surrendering to what their doctrine had taught them to regard as a subhuman enemy. Their fanaticism was a tactical asset in the narrowest sense. They would hold positions longer than rational men would hold them, but it was also the thing that made negotiated solutions impossible in the sectors they controlled. SS units posted at key intersections and transit points enforced the defense not just against the enemy, but against their own side. Executing soldiers found retreating without orders, hanging bodies from lampposts with cardboard signs accusing them of cowardice. Fear became a command tool, wielded with the same cold efficiency as any weapon. Then there were the boys. The Hitler Youth had spent years being shaped into instruments of the state, drilled in marching and ideology and the romantic vocabulary of sacrifice. Now, in the spring of 1945, that preparation was being cashed in. Boys as young as 15 and 16 were handed anti-tank weapons, the single-shot disposable launchers that had become Germany's answer to Soviet armor, and assigned to defensive positions throughout the city. They received training that could be measured in days rather than weeks. Some of them had never fired a weapon in combat. Some had never been further from their homes than a summer camp. They were put into cellars and rubble fields and told to aim at the tracks of Soviet tanks, and many of them did exactly that, because they had been raised inside a system that equated obedience with virtue and death with honor. The officers who deployed them knew what they were asking. Some of those officers looked away when they wrote the deployment orders. Others did not look away at all. At the other end of the age spectrum stood the Volkssturm, the People's Militia, a force conjured by decree in the autumn of 1944 to fill the widening gaps in Germany's formal military structure. The Volkssturm drew from men who had already been deemed unfit for regular service, those over 45, those with chronic health conditions, those whose civilian occupations had previously exempted them from the draft, factory workers, teachers, postal clerks, shopkeepers, men whose last military experience, if they had any at all, belonged to a different war entirely. Some were issued uniforms, many were not, fighting instead in their civilian clothes with a single armband to distinguish them from the civilians they had been a few months before. Their weapons were often obsolete, drawn from captured stockpiles or pre-war reserves. Their training amounted to a few hours of basic instruction before they were marched to positions and told to hold. Their courage, where it existed, was real. Their effectiveness against a modern combined arms force was, in almost every case, tragically limited. Morale inside this assembled force was not uniform, and understanding that fact is essential to understanding what the defense actually looked like on the ground. There were men who genuinely believed that some combination of new weapons, relief armies, or sheer German will might still alter the outcome. These men fought with a conviction that made them dangerous in close quarters. There were others who had long since stopped believing in anything beyond the welfare of the men standing immediately beside them, the oldest instinct in any army, loyalty compressed down to its smallest and most durable unit. And there were others still who were present only because the alternative to fighting was an execution carried out by their own side. The defense of Berlin was held together by all three of these motivations simultaneously, which is to say, it was held together by faith, fraternity, and terror in roughly equal measure. The city itself shaped what the defense could become. Berlin's urban geography, its wide avenues, its river crossings, its dense residential blocks, its government buildings constructed with the permanence of empire in mind, gave defenders certain natural advantages that open terrain would never have offered. A single determined squad in a reinforced cellar could delay an advancing company. A single anti-tank weapon positioned at a street corner could threaten armor forced to navigate narrow gaps between burning buildings. Urban warfare of this kind was grinding and intimate and punishing to attackers, and the German defenders understood this even when they understood nothing else about their strategic position. They built their plans around delay. Every hour bought was an hour in which something, anything, might change. The logic was increasingly irrational. The tactics, at the level of the individual position, were sometimes sound. Equipment shortages defined the texture of the defense in ways that no amount of resolve could overcome. Anti-tank guns were allocated to positions based on ammunition supplies rather than tactical necessity. Communications between sectors broke down regularly as the telephone network was damaged by air raids, and the radio equipment was shared among too many units with too few frequencies. Runners, actual human beings moving on foot through streets under fire, became one of the primary means by which commanders received information and issued orders. Medical supplies were critically short. Food distribution had become irregular enough that soldiers and civilians in some districts were already going hungry before the assault began in earnest. The machinery of a modern military was present in its outlines, but hollowed out in its substance, running on the fumes of what had once been a formidable logistical system. Against this force, exhausted, patchwork, short of everything, the Soviet military machine was arraying itself with a weight that no honest assessment could regard as anything other than overwhelming. The Red Army that had absorbed the worst the Wehrmacht could throw at it in the catastrophic years of 1941 and 1942, and had learned from every disaster, had become by 1945 something formidable in ways that German planners consistently underestimated. It was coordinated, it was supplied, it had absorbed lessons about urban warfare from Stalingrad and every contested city between there and the Oder. It brought artillery in concentrations that would make the ground itself seem to move. It brought engineers capable of bridging rivers under fire, armor capable of operating alongside infantry in close terrain, and commanders who had spent years developing the doctrine of combined arms assault to a point where it was executed with something approaching fluency. There is something in the specific human texture of this mismatch that resists easy summary. A boy of 16 with a disposable anti-tank launcher, crouching in a cellar in Spandau or Charlottenburg, was not simply a unit in a defensive order of battle. He was a child placed in an impossible situation by a system that had spent years training him to believe that the situation was not only possible, but noble. An elderly clockmaker issued a rifle he had not fired since another century, assigned to guard a street corner against tanks. He was not a soldier in any meaningful sense. He was evidence of a regime's willingness to spend lives it had no right to spend. The defenders of Berlin were real people, with real fear and real courage and real confusion, and they deserve to be understood as such, even as what they were defending is understood for exactly what it was. What assembled itself in Berlin in the weeks and days before the Soviet offensive was not capable of stopping what was coming. Everyone with access to clear information understood this, from the general staff officers who filed their assessments in language carefully calibrated to avoid the word hopeless, to the sergeants who looked at their platoons and did the arithmetic. The defense would cost lives, Soviet lives, German military lives, and above all the lives of the civilians sheltering in the cellars below the streets where the fighting would happen. It would buy time. It would not buy salvation. The city was preparing not for victory, but for an ending. a particular kind of ending that would be brutal enough to be felt for generations, and final enough to mark the absolute limit of what a ruined ideology could demand of the people it had raised to serve it. By the spring of 1945, the city of Berlin held more than 2 million civilians within its boundaries. They were not soldiers. They were not party officials with cars waiting at the curb and country estates to flee to. They were the people who had always been there. The baker who had opened his shop on the same corner for 30 years. The schoolteacher who still arrived each morning out of habit, even when the classrooms sat empty. The mother who kept her children's shoes lined up neatly by the door, as though order itself might protect them. These were ordinary men and women who had lived through the years of Nazi triumph, who had watched the parades and the promises, and the war news that always spoke of victory. Now the war news had stopped speaking of victory entirely, and the city around them was changing in ways that made the stomach clench. The official position, broadcast from radio towers and printed in newspapers that grew thinner by the week, was that Berlin would hold. Propaganda Minister Goebbels, who had himself moved his family into the city rather than out of it, appeared in public to reassure Berliners that relief was coming, that enemy advances would be broken, that the capital of the Reich was impregnable. Some people believed him. Others had stopped believing long before, but belief and action are two different things, and leaving Berlin in those final months was far harder than simply deciding to go. Travel required permits. Railways were clogged with military traffic. Roads east were closed to civilians or choked with retreating columns. The machinery of the state, even a collapsing state, retained enough force to keep people in place. There had been attempts to move civilians out of the city in earlier months. Women and children from the most exposed eastern districts had been encouraged, and sometimes ordered, to relocate westward. Some did leave, families who had the means, the connections, or simply the nerve to pack a single suitcase and walk away from everything they had built. But the numbers who left were vastly outweighed by the numbers who stayed. Many Berliners had nowhere else to go. Others had elderly relatives who could not be moved. Some simply refused to believe, even as Soviet artillery could be heard on clear nights like a low, continuous thunder beyond the eastern horizon, that the city itself would become a battlefield. Cities like Berlin did not become battlefields. That happened somewhere else, to other people. What those civilians could not fully know was that the military infrastructure being constructed around them was not a sign of strength. It was an admission of desperation. The city had been divided into a series of defensive rings, each one intended to slow the Soviet advance and buy time. The innermost ring, known as the Citadel, encompassed the government district at the heart of Berlin, where the Chancellery and the bunker complex sat. Beyond that, ring after ring of barricades, anti-tank obstacles, and reinforced strongpoints extended outward into the residential suburbs. Civilians watched as work gangs filled the streets with constructions of rubble and paving stones, as tram cars were pushed sideways across junctions to form makeshift barriers, as park benches and lamp posts were dragged into positions that had no purpose except to slow down a tank for a few additional seconds. The labor for much of this construction fell partly on the civilians themselves. Men who were too old for the front or too young were organized into work details and sent to dig trenches in parks and sports fields, to fill sandbags, to haul materials from one part of the city to another. Women were enrolled in civil defense units. Children as young as 14 were being funneled into auxiliary roles that would, within weeks, become combat roles. The city was consuming its own people even before the first Soviet shell fell on a Berlin street. There was a grim arithmetic to it. The regime needed bodies, and the city was full of bodies that had not yet been used. Food was becoming a serious concern. The supply chains that had fed 2 million people, trains carrying grain, trucks bringing vegetables from the surrounding countryside, barges moving along the canals, were all being disrupted by the same military operations that were supposed to protect the city. Ration allocations had been cut repeatedly. Shops that had once been stocked now displayed gaps where staples used to sit. Families began quietly moving canned goods and dried food into their cellars, not as a formal preparation, but as an instinct, the way animals move before a storm. Water, too, was something people thought about in new ways. If the water mains were hit, if the pumping stations went down, what would they drink? The questions that had once seemed absurd began to seem entirely reasonable. The cellars of Berlin became the subject of serious planning in a way they had not been before. Families who shared a building, the tenants of the great apartment blocks that filled the working-class neighborhoods, began to organize their basement spaces collectively. They moved mattresses down below street level, brought down chairs and blankets and small stoves. They stocked whatever food they could spare, placed buckets near the walls for sanitation, cleared pathways from the cellar to secondary exits in case the main stairs were blocked by rubble. None of this was centrally coordinated. It emerged from the collective wisdom of people who had already survived years of Allied bombing raids and knew, without being told, what being underground meant. The cellar was survival. The cellar was where you went when the world above became uninhabitable. Hospitals across the city were bracing for what was coming. Wards were cleared and reorganized. Staff who had already been working under the stress of years of wartime casualty loads now began preparing for something categorically different. Not bombed-out buildings and burn victims from air raids, but the kind of mass casualties that street warfare produced. Medical supplies were being consolidated and hidden in places less likely to be destroyed. Doctors and nurses who could have left Berlin chose, overwhelmingly, to stay with their patients. This was not heroism in any dramatic sense. It was simply the continuation of duty in conditions where duty had become extraordinarily costly. The psychological state of Berlin's civilian population in these weeks defies easy summary. Fear was present, surely, but it existed alongside a strange numbness that comes from sustained stress. People who had been afraid for months, for years, reached a point where the fear became the background of daily life rather than an acute sensation. They went through routines. They queued for bread. They swept the rubble from their front steps. They collected their children from wherever their children were, with a mechanical quality, as though the act of continuing normal behavior was itself a form of resistance against the knowledge of what was coming. Some people recorded this in diaries. The entries from that period have a quality of controlled understatement that says more than panic ever could. There were also people who broke entirely under the pressure. Suicides increased sharply as the weeks passed. Not only among officials and party members with particular reasons to fear the approaching forces, but among ordinary civilians, elderly people who had lost everything, women alone with children and no sense of what would happen to them, men who had outlived their families and saw nothing worth surviving for. The pharmacies, while they still had stock, were visited by people asking for pills or tonics in quantities that told their own story. Neighbors looked the other way. There was an unspoken understanding that in circumstances like these, judgment was a luxury no one could afford. Children experienced all of this through a particular kind of distortion. For the youngest, the abnormality of their circumstances had become normal. The absence of school, the presence of uniforms everywhere, the strange furniture of war filling the streets. Older children, those in their early teens, were in a more complicated position. Some had been enrolled in the Hitler Youth for years and had absorbed its ideology deeply enough that they believed, genuinely, in the fight that was coming. Others were simply terrified and trying to pretend they were not. Mothers throughout Berlin were carrying the weight of keeping their children from complete despair while carrying their own terror quietly in the small hours of the night. What distinguished these weeks, those final weeks before the offensive began, was not the presence of dramatic events but the steady accumulation of dread. Berlin in early April of 1945 was a city that had not yet been destroyed but knew it was going to be. The evidence was everywhere, in the soldiers on every corner, in the barricades that turned familiar streets into obstacles, in the absence of men between the ages of 16 and 60 from any civilian context, in the distant sound that grew imperceptibly louder with each passing night. The 2 million people who had not left, who could not leave, who had decided for reasons practical or emotional, or simply because they had no alternative, settled in to wait. They went down into their cellars, they held their children close, and they listened to the sound of the east getting nearer. Whatever was coming, was coming. There was nothing left to do but endure it. By the spring of 1945, 2 great military machines were converging on Germany from opposite directions. From the east, the Red Army had already crossed the Oder River, positioning itself within striking distance of Berlin itself. From the west, the combined forces of the United States and Britain had swept through France, crossed the Rhine, and stood poised to drive deep into the heart of the Reich. On paper, it looked like a race. In reality, it was something far more deliberate and far more consequential. The Western advance had not stalled because of German resistance, nor because of supply shortages or terrain. It had slowed because men at the very top of the Allied command had decided, coldly and carefully, that Berlin was not their prize to claim. What unfolded in those weeks was not a failure of momentum. It was a choice, one of the most consequential choices made in the entire European war. To understand that choice, you have to go back several months to the negotiating tables where the shape of post-war Europe was being quietly drawn. At the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, the leaders of the 3 great Allied powers, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, had divided Germany into predetermined occupation zones long before a single Soviet boot had touched Berlin's cobblestones. Under those agreements, Berlin fell within the zone designated for Soviet occupation, even though the city itself would later be subdivided among all 4 powers. This was not an accident of geography. It was a deliberate partition, drawn by men who understood that whoever physically held a piece of territory when the guns fell silent would hold enormous leverage in everything that followed. The occupation zones were not simply administrative conveniences, they were the architecture of the post-war world, and both sides knew it. Dwight Eisenhower, commanding the Allied Expeditionary Force in the West, drew his own strategic conclusions from those political realities. In late March of 1945, he sent a direct communication to Stalin, bypassing the usual chain of diplomatic protocol, announcing that American forces would not push toward Berlin. Instead, Eisenhower planned to drive southward and eastward toward Leipzig and Dresden, cutting Germany in 2 and eliminating what Allied intelligence feared might be a so-called national redoubt, a last fortified stronghold where die-hard Nazi forces might make a prolonged final stand in the Bavarian and Austrian Alps. Whether that redoubt ever truly existed in any serious form remains one of history's more ironic footnotes. But in the spring of 1945, it was a genuine operational concern, and Eisenhower gave it serious weight. His decision to redirect Allied effort away from Berlin was, in his own framing, a military one. Critics then and since have argued it was also a political abdication of the First Order. Churchill was furious. The British Prime Minister had never shared the American faith that post-war relations with the Soviet Union would be smooth or cooperative. He had watched with growing unease as Soviet power expanded westward, and he understood, with uncomfortable clarity, that every kilometre of German soil the Red Army captured was a kilometre of leverage Stalin would never relinquish. Churchill wrote to Roosevelt urging a reconsideration, arguing that there was enormous symbolic and strategic value in Western forces reaching Berlin first. He believed that arriving at the German capital before the Soviets could reshape the psychology of the post-war settlement, giving the Western powers a bargaining chip of almost incalculable value. Roosevelt, already gravely ill and exhausted, did not share Churchill's alarm. The president had invested deeply in the vision of continued Allied cooperation through the newly proposed United Nations framework, and he was reluctant to make moves that might antagonize Stalin at precisely the moment that framework was being assembled. The correspondence between London and Washington in those weeks reads, in retrospect, as a quiet tragedy. Two men with different visions of the world arguing over a decision that neither would fully live to see resolved. On the ground, the men who would have had to fight for Berlin had their own views, and they were rarely consulted. American field commanders had watched their forces cover extraordinary distances in the weeks following the Rhine crossing. Units that had been crawling through the hedgerows of Normandy less than a year before were now ranging deep into Germany with a speed that astonished even their own commanders. General George Patton, driving his Third Army with characteristic aggression, was convinced that American forces could reach Berlin before the Soviets if given the fuel and the orders to do so. Patton's confidence was probably not unfounded in purely logistical terms, but he was not given those orders. The halt lines were drawn, the boundaries were communicated down through the chain of command, and American forces who sometimes found themselves ahead of their assigned stop lines were ordered to pull back. Soldiers who had fought across an entire continent were told to wait. The war for them was effectively over in all but name, and they waited in that strange suspended state while the Eastern Front burned. The Wehrmacht commanders facing the Western Allies watched all of this with a mixture of desperation and bitter calculation. For months, German officers on the Western Front had been quietly probing for signs that the Americans or British might accept some form of negotiated arrangement, a surrender in the West that would allow German forces to regroup and resist the Soviet advance in the East. This was never a serious diplomatic possibility, but it reflected the profound terror that Wehrmacht commanders felt at the prospect of Soviet occupation. These were men who had spent years fighting on the Eastern Front, who understood what total defeat at Soviet hands would mean not just for soldiers, but for the millions of German civilians in the path of the Red Army's advance. Some senior German figures made discreet and ultimately futile overtures toward Western commanders, hoping that shared anti-communist sentiment might somehow translate into a strategic arrangement. It never did. The Allied commitment to unconditional surrender was absolute, and no separate peace was possible. There is a certain grim irony in the fact that German forces on the Western Front, knowing the war was lost, fought with sharply diminishing intensity against the Americans and British, even as they poured their remaining strength into the East. Entire units effectively walked into American captivity in preference to Soviet capture. Roads in Western Germany in those final weeks were clogged with German soldiers moving not to fight, but to surrender to the Western Allies before the front dissolved entirely. They were not wrong to fear the alternative. The distinction they drew between their two sets of enemies was not an ideological abstraction. It was grounded in the brutal logic of what surrender to each side would mean in practice. American prisoner of war cages, however overcrowded and difficult, offered a prospect of survival. Soviet captivity, for many, did not. For the civilians of Eastern Germany and Berlin itself, the Western halt was not a strategic calculation. It was a sentence. Every day that passed without a Western advance toward Berlin was another day in which the city's population would be left to face the coming storm alone, sheltered by nothing but the collapsing ruins of a regime that had already decided their survival was secondary to its own mythology. There were people in Berlin in those weeks who listened for any news of American forces, who traced rumors of Western advances on hand-drawn maps, who told themselves and each other that perhaps the Americans would arrive before the Soviets. That hope was not entirely irrational. It was simply wrong. The Americans were not coming, and the decisions that had made that certainty had been reached not on the battlefield but in conference rooms months earlier, by men in suits and uniforms who would not themselves be buried in Berlin's rubble. Eisenhower's decision, and the political agreements that underpinned it, have been argued over by historians for the better part of 8 decades. Some have concluded that the Supreme Commander was correct, that the agreed occupation zones made Berlin irrelevant as a military objective, that casualties in a race for the city would have been enormous, and that the post-war division of Germany would have unfolded largely the same way, regardless of who captured the capital. Others have argued that Churchill's instincts were sound, that arriving in Berlin first would have given the Western powers a psychological and diplomatic weight in the post-war negotiations that they conspicuously lacked, and that the Soviet dominance of Eastern Europe that followed might have been challenged more effectively from a position of greater strength. Neither argument is fully wrong, and neither is fully right. History rarely offers those clean resolutions. What the Western halt accomplished with absolute certainty was this: it left the Red Army as the sole instrument of Berlin's final destruction and capture. More than 2 million Soviet soldiers would pour into the city in the weeks ahead, fighting block by block through a world of rubble and fire. The cost in Soviet lives, in German lives, and in the lives of the civilians caught between them would be staggering. The occupation that followed would impose its own particular weight on the people of the eastern city and the eastern zone for decades to come. None of that was inevitable in the sense that it could not have been otherwise. It was, rather, the accumulated consequence of decisions made at conference tables, in telegrams, and in the quiet ordering of halt lines that stopped Western armies at the edge of what might have been. There is a particular quality to the silence that settled over the Western Front in those final weeks. The silence of armies that had stopped moving, of soldiers cleaning weapons they would not need to fire again, of commanders reading maps of a city they had decided, or been ordered, not to enter. It was the silence of geopolitics asserting itself over the instincts of soldiers, and on the other side of that silence, moving through the mud and smoke of the eastern approaches, the Red Army continued westward, carrying with it all the fury and suffering of 4 years of catastrophic war. Berlin was waiting, and it was waiting alone. In the frozen world of eastern Poland, the Red Army stands at the threshold of its greatest offensive. It is early January 1945, and Soviet forces have assembled along the Vistula River with a single objective: to drive westward into the heart of Germany and crush the Nazi regime before spring. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's foremost military strategist, commands more than 2 million troops, backed by over 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. His supply lines stretch across hundreds of kilometers of conquered territory, and his soldiers, hardened by 4 years of brutal warfare against Germany, hunger for vengeance and victory. The German High Command, aware of the threat, but stripped of reserves and mobility by years of attritional fighting, can field barely 500,000 defenders across the entire Eastern Front. To the officers studying maps in German command posts, the arithmetic of war has become horrifyingly simple. One side possesses overwhelming superiority, and the other possesses only the hope that somehow miraculous reserves might arrive or the enemy might stumble. January will prove that miracles do not come to those who deserve them least. The offensive explodes on the 12th of January 1945, when Zhukov's armies lurch forward across the ice of the Vistula in temperatures that sink below -20 degrees Celsius. The northern thrust, under Marshal Ivan Konev, drives through central Poland toward Warsaw and beyond, while Marshal Georgy Zhukov's assault group pushes directly toward the Oder River and the gateway to Berlin. Soviet artillery pounds German positions with an intensity rarely seen even in this vast and destructive conflict. Some reports describe barrages involving over 100 guns firing simultaneously against single defensive strongpoints. German soldiers, many of them replacements with minimal training and morale, already fractured by years of retreat, are overwhelmed by the sheer mechanical superiority of Soviet firepower. The initial German defensive line, hastily constructed along the Vistula, crumbles within days. Entire divisions dissolve under the weight of Soviet assault, their survivors retreating westward in disorganized columns toward the next prepared position. The Soviet advance covers tens of kilometers in the first week alone, and German commanders watching from headquarters face the nauseating reality that no effective reserves exist to seal the breach. What was meant to be a sustained defense becomes instead a succession of brief delaying actions, each one more desperate and futile than the last. The speed of the Soviet advance proves almost as demoralizing to the Wehrmacht as the firepower. Soviet mechanized columns, moving in good order despite the bitter cold, penetrate deep into German-held territory, threatening to encircle and destroy entire formations. At several points, desperate German counterattacks, mounted by Panzer Corps stripped from other sectors, briefly slow the Soviet momentum, but these are temporary interruptions rather than solutions. A German counterattack near Warsaw inflicts heavy casualties on the Soviet forces attacking the city, but the Soviet generals simply absorb these losses and continue driving forward. The fundamental calculus is unmistakable. The Germans lose soldiers they cannot replace, while Soviet reinforcements arrive constantly from the depths of an apparently inexhaustible reserve. German commanders report back to higher headquarters with a kind of hollow numbness in their assessments. They are not panicked. Panic has given way to a cold recognition of mathematics that admits no favorable outcome. One field commander notes in his diary that the Red Army no longer needs strategy or cunning. The sheer weight of numbers and material makes defeat certain unless Germany can somehow manufacture an entirely new army from nothing. No such army exists. No reserves are coming. The Germans are losing not because they are outfought, but because they are outnumbered by margins that render courage and tactical skill almost irrelevant. By the end of January, the Red Army has advanced nearly 500 kilometers from the Vistula. Soviet spearheads have crossed into German territory proper, and refugees from East Prussia and the territories adjacent to Poland begin streaming westward, carrying tales of Soviet advance guards moving faster than news itself. German civilians in Berlin, listening to official radio broadcasts that describe tactical withdrawals and straightening of the front, sense the lie beneath the words. They understand, with the grim intuition that only those living under imminent threat can muster, that the Red Army is coming to Berlin. The psychological impact on the city radiates in whispered conversations, in the sudden acceleration of evacuation efforts by government ministries, and in the feverish activity around Nazi Party headquarters. Hitler himself, informed of the offensive's progress, alternates between rages at his generals and retreats into the bunker complex beneath the Chancellery, where he can better insulate himself from the reality closing in from the east. Senior party officials, sensing which way the wind now blows, begin making discreet arrangements, safety deposit boxes secured, documents destroyed, escape routes planned. The comfortable certainty that has sustained the Nazi regime begins to crack along its foundations. The defensive line along the Oder River represents Germany's last genuine chance to slow the Soviet advance, and both armies recognize this fact. The Oder runs roughly north to south, and at several points the river is wide and relatively deep, offering natural defensive advantages. More importantly, the Oder lies merely 80 kilometers from Berlin itself, and Soviet generals know that if they can cross this barrier, the road to the Nazi capital lies open before them. German commanders have attempted to fortify the Oder line, but manpower shortages and the rapidity of the Soviet advance mean that these fortifications are incomplete and thinly held. When Soviet assault units reach the river in late January, they discover that German forces, though desperate, are more fragmented than ever. Some sections of the line are defended stubbornly. Others collapse almost immediately. German panzer divisions attempt to counterattack from prepared positions, and for several days in late January and early February, fighting along the Oder becomes intense and costly to both sides. The frozen river becomes a staging ground for assault crossings by Soviet engineers, while German artillery and machine guns exact a terrible price for each advance. But the outcome of these struggles seems predetermined. The Soviets can absorb losses that would break any other army, and they simply continue attacking, pressing forward relentlessly. The German counterattacks, though locally successful in several sectors, ultimately achieve nothing except the expenditure of fuel, ammunition, and soldiers who will never be replaced. A German panzer corps under General Hasso von Manteuffel, one of the Wehrmacht's more capable commanders, manages to inflict significant casualties on Soviet bridgeheads east of the Oder in the middle weeks of February. The German operations in this sector are tactically proficient, the counterattacks are well coordinated, the artillery support impressive by late war standards, and the results measurable in destroyed Soviet tanks and ground regained. Yet all of this expertise cannot overcome the fundamental problem. For every Soviet tank destroyed, 2 more arrive to replace it. For every Soviet soldier killed, 3 more arrive in transport vehicles and on foot. The law of attrition, once Germany's greatest strength during the early years of the war, when German tactical superiority could multiply the effects of smaller numbers, has become Germany's executioner. With no capacity to replace losses and no reserves of fresh troops available, each German victory becomes merely an extension of the inevitable defeat. German officers, educated in warfare and strategy, understand this with perfect clarity. They continue to fight because they are soldiers and because disobedience is death, not because they harbor any illusion of ultimate success. The Soviet drive to the Oder also reveals cracks in the German political and military command structure that can no longer be papered over. Hitler, enraged by the loss of territory and the failure of counterattacks to achieve decisive results, dismisses several senior commanders and replaces them with military men he trusts more completely, which is to say, men more willing to execute his orders regardless of whether those orders make military sense. General Gotthard Heinrici, an officer of genuine talent appointed to command the defense of Berlin in the final phase of the war, repeatedly protests to Hitler about the impossibility of the task before him. The Red Army, Heinrich argues, will attack Berlin with a numerical and material advantage so crushing that no amount of determination or fighting skill can overcome it. Hitler responds with fury, accusing Heinrich of defeatism and threatening him with court-martial if his forces do not hold the Oder line. The dynamic between Hitler and his remaining generals becomes increasingly poisoned by mutual contempt barely concealed beneath the surface of military discipline. Hitler despises his generals for their realistic assessments of the situation. His generals despise Hitler for his persistent refusal to acknowledge reality. Yet the chain of command remains intact, and orders flow from the bunker with the same authority they carried years earlier, even if that authority now rests on nothing but the threat of execution for those who disobey. Life in Berlin transforms as the proximity of the Red Army becomes undeniable. The city's inhabitants, previously sustained by official propaganda and the hope that miracle weapons might yet turn the tide, now confront the certainty of imminent invasion. Some Berliners attempt to flee westward toward the American and British armies approaching from France, accepting Soviet occupation as preferable to remaining in a city that will soon become a fortress under siege. Others, party members, SS men, and those too frightened to move, burrow deeper into Berlin's cellars and bunkers, preparing for a siege of unknown duration. The atmosphere in the city becomes increasingly claustrophobic and paranoid. Rumors spread about Soviet atrocities committed against German civilians in territories the Red Army has already conquered, stories that carry just enough truth to be credible and terrifying in their implications. Factory workers labor to construct anti-tank obstacles and barricades throughout the city's neighborhoods. Hitler Youth boys march through the streets in formation, dressed in uniforms too large for their frames. Elderly men are conscripted into home defense units and given minimal training and outdated weapons. Berlin, the capital of a once mighty empire, becomes a vast armaments factory and fortified position all at once, preparing for its transformation into a battleground. The strategic implications of the Soviet advance to the Oder are staggering in their finality. For the first time since the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Berlin itself faces imminent threat from invasion from the east. No longer is the war something that happens in distant theaters or in other people's territories. It is now coming home to the heartland of the Nazi state. German military planners recognize with absolute clarity that the Oder line is the last defensive barrier of any significance between Soviet forces and the capital. Beyond the Oder stretches the relatively flat terrain of Brandenburg, with Berlin sitting in a depression that offers few natural defensive advantages. The Western Allies, advancing much more slowly through Germany from the west, have already made clear through their strategic movements that they will not race the Soviets to Berlin. The British and Americans will allow the Soviet Union to take the German capital, a decision made at the highest levels of political authority, with full awareness of the consequences it would entail for Berlin's population and for the post-war division of Europe. German commanders, reading the movements of American and British armies, understand that they can expect no assistance from the West, no diversion of Soviet forces northward or southward, no miraculous intervention that might save their capital. The Red Army, with access to all of the Soviet Union's vast war-making resources, will attack Berlin when it is ready, and Berlin will fall. The Oder line itself becomes the site of a brutal and bitter struggle that extends through February and into March, with neither side willing to commit to a full-scale offensive that would surely produce losses of apocalyptic proportions. Soviet commanders probe German defenses, testing weak points and gradually expanding their bridgeheads on the western bank of the river. German reserves, sparse and scattered, are shuttled between threatened sectors in desperate attempts to maintain the line. The fighting reaches a crescendo in mid-February when Soviet forces launch a major assault aimed at breaking through near Frankfurt under Oder, a city commanding a strategic crossing point. The assault fails, repulsed by German defenders who fight with the desperation that comes from understanding they are defending the gateway to their homeland. Soviet forces regroup and prepare for another assault, while German commanders gather what few reserves remain and position them to meet the inevitable next attack. The cycle of thrust and parry, assault and counter-assault, continues through the winter and into the spring, with the line shifting only marginally, despite the enormous expenditure of lives and material. Yet all participants understand that this standoff is temporary, that the Red Army is gathering strength, and that when it finally commits to a full-scale assault on Berlin, no German defense will be capable of stopping it. The Oder line will hold for months, not because of German invulnerability, but because Soviet generals are methodically preparing the greatest offensive operation in military history, one that will combine more firepower and troops than have ever been assembled on a single battlefield. The human cost of the Soviet advance from the Vistula to the Oder, though staggering, is borne almost entirely by soldiers rather than the civilian population over most of the route. Soviet soldiers, some of them veterans of 4 years of warfare, others replacements with minimal training, pour westward across the ice and snow, suffering from cold as much as from German bullets and artillery. The Soviet casualty rate is horrific by any standard. Tens of thousands killed, wounded, or missing in each major operation. Losses that would have been considered unacceptable by Western armies, but which the Soviet Union has learned to absorb as the price of victory. German soldiers, particularly those in units that are surrounded or cut off from retreat, face choices between surrender to an enemy they have been taught to fear and fight to the death. Many choose surrender, understanding that continued resistance is futile. Others fight to the end, either from fanaticism or from fear of what Soviet captivity might entail. The ground between the Vistula and the Oder becomes a vast charnel house, filled with the bodies of soldiers from both sides left behind in the frozen earth. Villages that have already been liberated once in the fighting are liberated again by advancing Soviet columns, their populations a mixture of relief and terror at the identity of their new liberators. The roads westward are choked with German refugees, wounded soldiers, and displaced persons, all moving in the same direction, all understanding that the Red Army is behind them and closing the distance. By the time Soviet forces secure their bridgeheads on the western bank of the Oder in March 1945, Berlin has crossed an invisible threshold from which there is no return. The capital is no longer a distant objective in a prolonged campaign. It is now an imminent reality, a siege waiting to occur, a final battle that will determine not merely the military outcome of the war, but the political future of Germany and Europe itself. German civilians in Berlin, particularly those old enough to remember the First World War and its aftermath, sense the arrival of catastrophe. Some seek escape routes, others accept what they believe is inevitable. The presence of Soviet forces just 80 kilometers away transforms Berlin from a functioning capital of a great power into something resembling a city under sentence of death. In the spring of 1945, Berlin underwent a metamorphosis born not of hope, but of desperation. The city that had celebrated conquest and expansion for more than a decade now braced itself for siege. The transformation was visible everywhere, in the streets, in the rubble already accumulating from Allied bombing raids, in the faces of inhabitants who understood that the approaching Red Army would show no mercy to the capital of the Reich. What had once been a showcase of Nazi architectural ambition became, almost overnight, a fortress under construction. Every neighborhood became a potential battleground. Every street corner, a defensive position. Every building, a potential stronghold or a tomb. The work began in earnest in March, roughly 2 months before the final Soviet assault would commence. Engineers and forced laborers, conscripted civilians, prisoners of war, anyone with the strength to move earth and carry materials, fanned out across Berlin's outskirts and into its heart. They erected anti-tank obstacles of every conceivable design, rows of concrete pyramids known as dragon's teeth, spikes welded together, barbed wire entanglements that stretched for kilometers, anti-tank guns positioned in commanding locations overlooking the broad streets that Soviet armored columns would inevitably use. The work was methodical and grim. Those directing the construction knew exactly what they were preparing for. Those doing the labor often understood they were building structures that would become their graves. The entire defensive perimeter took shape not according to any unified strategic vision, but through a desperate patchwork of measures, each attempting to slow, to impede, to complicate the inevitable assault that everyone knew was coming. Within the city itself, the atmosphere grew increasingly frantic. The Nazi regime's most senior officials began, at last, to contemplate the reality of defeat. Adolf Hitler, now ensconced in the bunker complex that lay beneath the Chancellery, a warren of reinforced concrete chambers and corridors, sunk roughly 30 meters into the earth, issued orders with diminishing connection to actual military circumstances. The bunker itself had been expanded and reinforced throughout 1944 and the early months of 1945. It was designed to be impregnable, to protect the Führer and his closest associates from the bombardment that everyone knew would soon intensify beyond anything yet experienced. Thick walls, air filtration systems, emergency generators, food stores, and sleeping quarters, all of it designed to allow Hitler and his circle to outlast the initial assault and continue issuing commands from this subterranean fortress. The bunker became, in the minds of those retreating into it, a kind of last bastion of Nazi power. In reality, it would become a tomb. The evacuation of government ministries occurred in stages, adding to the sense of disintegration that spread through the population. The regime that had once proclaimed itself eternal, destined to rule for 1,000 years, began quietly moving records, treasures, and personnel out of Berlin toward the remaining safe zones. Archives were boxed and transported south. Artworks that had been looted from across conquered Europe were moved to secure locations. The SS began destroying incriminating documents, evidence of the regime's crimes that would be discovered in the coming weeks and months. This evacuation was never officially announced, never explained to the public, but it sent a clear and unmistakable message. Berlin was being abandoned. The government that had ruled from this city was preparing to exit it. The city's inhabitants, numbering more than 2 million souls, were being left behind to face whatever came next. Even as the government retreated beneath the earth, Hitler issued increasingly desperate orders regarding the city's defense. General Gotthard Heinrici, commanding the German forces arrayed against the approaching Soviets, was ordered to hold the Oder line at all costs. Reinhardt, commanding Army Group Vistula, received similar instructions. Hitler demanded that every street in Berlin be defended, that the city be held to the last man, that there would be no retreat, no surrender. These orders were delivered with all the force that Hitler could muster, but those receiving them understood them as death sentences. The defenders already in place were exhausted, depleted by years of combat on the Eastern Front. The reinforcements being gathered were inadequate in every measurable way. The coordination between military commanders was deteriorating as the Nazi command structure collapsed under its own corruption and inefficiency. Yet the orders were clear. Berlin would be defended, or the defenders would die attempting it. The recruitment of Berlin's final defensive force accelerated through March and into April. Desperately needed manpower was gathered from every available source. Wehrmacht units that had been shattered in combat along the Eastern Front were reassembled, their surviving members consolidated into undersized battalions. SS formations were ordered to remain and fight to the death. The Hitler Youth, boys in their early teens, some barely more than children, were organized into military units and given weapons and uniforms that often fit them poorly, if at all. Old men, many of them First World War veterans who had never expected to hold a rifle again, were recruited into the Volkssturm, the People's Storm, a desperate militia of the last resort. These elderly civilians were given minimal training and inadequate equipment. Some received rifles, some were issued Panzerfausts, single-use anti-tank weapons that were dangerous to their operators as they were to their targets, and some received nothing but instructions to use whatever weapons they could find. The composition of Berlin's garrison reflected not military strength but complete desperation. This was an army assembled from the dregs, from those too young, too old, too broken, or too ideologically committed to abandon the city. The psychological state of Berlin's population oscillated between denial and terror. In some quarters, there remained a kind of willful belief that the Führer possessed some secret weapon, some miraculous turn of events that would reverse the tide. These were the true believers, the Nazi Party members whose entire lives had been invested in the regime's ideology. Others recognized the hopelessness but were trapped by fear of Nazi security forces, by family obligations, by simple inertia, and the overwhelming exhaustion of having lived under constant stress and bombardment for months. Still others began to contemplate what Soviet occupation would mean. The Soviet Union had suffered immeasurably at German hands. Millions of Soviet citizens had been killed in the German invasion and the subsequent years of warfare. The Red Army would arrive in Berlin as a force of conquest, not liberation. Many Berliners, particularly women, were seized by a terror so profound that it transcended rational calculation. The regime had taught them what to expect. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels circulated stories of Soviet brutality, some exaggerated, some rooted in real incidents, all designed to reinforce the message that surrender to the Soviets meant annihilation. Yet the alternative, standing and fighting, seemed equally catastrophic. In the government district, the regime's leaders occupied themselves with matters both practical and increasingly surreal. Hitler, now in his final weeks, spent much of his time in the bunker, emerging rarely to the surface. His physical and mental deterioration had become apparent to those around him. The trembling hands, the rambling monologues, the detachment from military reality that had always been part of his character but now bordered on complete dissociation. Yet he retained absolute authority over those around him. Subordinates who dared to suggest surrender or negotiation were removed from position or, in some cases, executed. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust and commander of the SS, began secretly attempting to negotiate with the Allies, believing that he might be able to secure some form of personal immunity if he abandoned the regime. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, and one of Hitler's most loyal followers, began making arrangements for the deaths of himself, his wife, and their 6 children. Hermann Göring, once Hitler's heir apparent and commander of the Air Force, had relocated south days earlier, abandoning Berlin. The regime was eating itself, its leaders recognizing the end, but unable to escape the gravitational pull of Hitler's presence and authority. The bunker complex itself became the stage for a kind of organizational breakdown, masquerading as continued governance. In the chambers beneath the chancellery, maps showed army positions that no longer existed. Generals reported on troop strengths that were fictional or vastly exaggerated. Hitler issued orders to commanders who had no troops to command, who were themselves surrounded and cut off from communication with any authority beyond their immediate locality. Supplies in the bunker were being rationed. The air filtration system, strained by the increasing number of people sheltering in the complex, became increasingly unreliable. Rumors spread, first of negotiated surrenders, then of Hitler's death, then of suicide pacts, then of last-minute military victories that would save the regime. The bunker became a kind of sealed psychological pressure vessel, accumulating desperation and stress with no outlet except through the increasingly irrational orders that Hitler continued to generate. Those trapped in it understood they were witnessing the final collapse of the regime they had served, often for decades, with absolute commitment and faith. Above ground, the city's physical transformation continued without pause. Streets were barricaded. Buildings were converted into strongpoints, their windows blocked, their ground floors prepared as fighting positions. The Landwehr Canal, which wound through the city, was prepared as a defensive obstacle. The Zoo Flak Tower, a massive concrete fortress originally built to house anti-aircraft guns, was converted into a final strongpoint that defenders vowed would hold until relieved or destroyed. Entire neighborhoods were designated as defensive sectors, each with its own commander and orders to resist until relieved. The S-Bahn railway lines, elevated above street level in much of the city, were prepared as supply routes and defensive positions. The subway system, the U-Bahn, became increasingly crucial as a means of movement beneath the bombardment that everyone anticipated. Food depots were scattered throughout the city, though most of them were already inadequate for the population they would need to sustain. Water supplies were threatened by damage to the infrastructure, and most of the city's hospitals were already packed with wounded from the bombing campaigns. The city transformed into something resembling less a capital and more a vast military camp designed to resist an inevitable siege. The construction of tank obstacles and barricades continued even as the sound of Soviet artillery grew closer and closer. In the final weeks of March and throughout April, the advance guard of the Red Army could occasionally be observed from the highest points in Berlin. The Oder line, once assumed to be far enough away to seem abstract, now seemed close enough to threaten immediate assault. German commanders in the field knew that the pause in Soviet operations, which had begun in January when Soviet forces reached the Oder, was a temporary respite. The Red Army was regrouping, bringing up supplies and reserves, preparing for what would be the final assault. The scale of the forces being concentrated for this assault was almost beyond comprehension. More than 2 million Soviet troops were gathering. Thousands upon thousands of tanks and self-propelled guns were being positioned. Artillery ammunition was being stockpiled in quantities that would dwarf anything yet seen in the European theatre. The assault, when it came, would be delivered with a weight of force that no German defensive line, no matter how well constructed or fiercely defended, could possibly withstand. Everyone in Berlin with any understanding of military matters understood this. The preparations were not designed to win. They were designed to delay, to resist, to make the final assault costly. In some cases, They were designed to provide cover for suicides and last stands that had more to do with honor and mythology than with any rational military objective. By the final days of April, with the Soviet assault imminent, Berlin had transformed into something that would have been unrecognizable to someone who had visited the city a decade earlier. The broad boulevards that had once been showcases of Nazi architectural ambition were now chopped into firing zones and anti-tank positions. The government district, the seat of Nazi power, was being prepared as the stage for a final stand that most of those preparing it knew would end in their deaths. The bunker was being sealed more completely each day, its occupants retreating further from the reality of what was happening in the city above. The city's population, more than 2 million human beings trapped in a space that was about to become a battlefield, prepared for what they knew would be catastrophic. Some prepared by gathering what food they could, others by digging or cleaning out cellars where they might shelter from the bombardment. Still others simply sat and waited, their capacity for action exhausted by years of warfare and stress, and the simple, overwhelming reality that there was nowhere to go and no escape from what was coming. Berlin, in those final days of April, was not a city preparing for victory. It was a city preparing for its own destruction. #narration. Chapter 9. In the winter of 1944 and into the new year, Soviet Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov had orchestrated one of the most ambitious military operations in human history. His armies had swept across Poland, crossed frozen rivers, and positioned themselves along a front that stretched more than 100 kilometers from north to south. The Red Army stood poised at the Oder River, a natural barrier that lay less than 80 kilometers from Berlin itself. German High Command had attempted to stabilize this line, but the reality on the ground told a different story. The Wehrmacht was exhausted, depleted, and running out of the reserves needed to mount any credible defense. By the middle of April, the moment that Stalin and Zhukov had been preparing for since Operation Barbarossa had begun 4 years earlier, was finally within reach. The encirclement and destruction of the Third Reich would not come through gradual attrition or negotiated surrender. It would come through overwhelming force, concentrated on a single objective, delivered with a ferocity that the German defenders would prove entirely unable to withstand. On the 16th of April in 1945, at approximately 0430 hours in the morning, Soviet artillery across the entire front erupted in what survivors would later describe as the opening of hell itself. The bombardment that followed was not merely heavy or intense, it was apocalyptic in scale. Soviet commanders had concentrated an estimated 2 million shells worth of ammunition behind the front lines, and they launched this arsenal with methodical precision. The barrage began with a rolling sequence of explosions that created a continuous wall of fire moving across German positions. Officers stationed in shelters reported that the earth itself seemed to convulse, that the concussions from nearby impacts were sufficient to throw men to the ground without direct contact from shrapnel or flame. The German defenders, positioned in hastily constructed fortifications and bunkers along the Oder's western bank, found themselves under assault from an artillery bombardment whose intensity they had rarely if ever experienced. Observers noted that the flash from the guns was so bright it turned night into day, and the smoke from the explosions created a haze so thick that visibility across the front was reduced to mere meters. The sound was described by survivors as existing beyond noise itself, a physical force that threatened sanity as much as it threatened bodies. For more than 2 hours, the Soviet artillery maintained this tempo without pause. The barrage was not random or scattered. It followed a precise tactical plan designed to neutralize German defensive positions, destroy command posts, and create breach points in the German line through which the Soviet assault troops could pour. Soviet commanders had learned through hard experience across 4 years of warfare that artillery preparation was not merely a prelude to ground assault, but the foundation upon which victory depended. The guns were positioned in depth, arranged so that as one wave of artillery completed its bombardment of a particular sector, fresh batteries would shift their fire to adjacent positions, maintaining continuous pressure across the entire front. German survivors spoke of the impossibility of communication once the barrage began. Telephone wires were severed, runners could not move between positions without being cut down, and officers found themselves isolated from their commands. The fortifications themselves, which German engineers had worked months to construct, proved inadequate against the sheer weight of explosives being directed at them. Bunkers were collapsed by near misses, barbed wire obstacles were torn to shreds, and the carefully prepared fields of fire were obliterated in clouds of earth and smoke. When the barrage finally began to shift inland at approximately 0630 hours, the signal was clear: the infantry assault would follow. Soviet assault troops, moving in waves and protected by heavy armor support, surged across the Oder at multiple crossing points. German defenders, many of them killed or wounded by the artillery bombardment, emerged from their shattered shelters to mount what resistance they could. The scene that unfolded was one of controlled chaos on the Soviet side and desperate confusion on the German. Soviet engineers had spent weeks preparing pontoon bridges and assault boats, and they deployed these with military precision. The first waves of Soviet troops crossed the river under cover of tank and anti-tank gunfire, establishing small bridgeheads on the western bank. German counterattacks, hastily organized and poorly coordinated due to the disruption of communications during the bombardment, achieved only temporary successes. In some sectors, German defenders managed to drive back the first Soviet assault waves, inflicting significant casualties. But the Soviets had prepared for this contingency. Their reserves were vast, their reinforcements immediate, and their determination was absolute. The speed of the Soviet breakthrough was stunning even by the standards of the Eastern Front. Within hours of the initial crossing, Soviet forces had established secure bridgeheads across the Oder at multiple locations. By the end of the first day, more than 100,000 Soviet troops had crossed the river and were pushing inland toward Berlin's outer defenses. German reserves, which had been concentrated further south to defend against expected attacks in other sectors, were hastily redirected northward, but they moved too slowly and in insufficient numbers to stem the tide. The Soviet advance, once it began to gain momentum, acquired a quality of inevitability. German officers watching the Soviet columns flowing across the bridgeheads and spreading out across the landscape recognized immediately that the outcome was predetermined. The question was no longer whether Berlin would fall, but how quickly it would fall, and what the city would look like when the Soviets reached it. The assault on Berlin itself could be measured in phases, and the first phase, the breakthrough from the Oder, lasted only a handful of days. Soviet mechanized columns, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns, advanced rapidly through the German defensive belt. The Silo Heights, a ridge overlooking the Oder plain to the east and offering significant defensive advantages, became the focal point of fierce fighting. German defenders, including reinforcements from SS units and Wehrmacht divisions pulled from other sectors, attempted to hold this terrain. Soviet commanders committed their reserves without hesitation, accepting heavy casualties in exchange for forward progress. The fighting at the Silo Heights was brutal and attritional, but the outcome was never truly in doubt. Soviet numerical superiority was too great, Soviet firepower too overwhelming, and German reserves too exhausted to mount an effective defense. By the 19th of April, Soviet forces had broken through the German defenses at the Silo Heights and were advancing rapidly toward Berlin's outer suburbs. In Berlin itself, the news of the Soviet breakthrough reached the Nazi leadership in the bunker with a delayed and distorted quality that reflected the regime's increasingly tenuous grip on reality. Hitler's intelligence officers provided him with situation reports that blended optimistic interpretation with ominous facts. Yes, the Soviets had crossed the Oder, but German counterattacks had inflicted heavy losses. Yes, the breakthrough was significant, but reserves were being positioned to contain it. Yes, Soviet forces were advancing toward Berlin, but surely the defenses of the capital itself would hold. This pattern of equivocation and denial characterized the bunker's response to each deteriorating situation. Above ground, in the streets and cellars of Berlin, the population braced for the ordeal that military observers and newspaper reports had warned was coming. Families crowded into basements and underground shelters. Those who could attempted to flee westward, desperate to reach the American and British lines before Soviet forces encircled the city. Barricades went up on Berlin's streets and thoroughfares. Military preparations that had been underway for weeks accelerated into frantic activity. The scope of the Soviet assault on Berlin, from the perspective of sheer scale and concentration of force, remains one of the most significant military operations in recorded history. More than 2 million Soviet troops were involved in the assault, and these soldiers represented the best equipped and most battle-hardened forces that the Soviet Union could field. The Red Army had learned through devastating experience how to conduct large-scale military operations, and the assault on Berlin represented the culmination of this learning process. Soviet commanders were ruthless in their willingness to expend manpower to achieve objectives. Casualties among Soviet troops were expected to be heavy, and they were. But the Soviets had calculated that these casualties were an acceptable price for the rapid conclusion of the European War and the achievement of Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe. From the 16th of April onward, the Soviet advance toward Berlin became an unstoppable force, carrying with it all the momentum and weight of the Red Army's entire march across the European continent. The first few days of the offensive also revealed the psychological dimensions of what was about to unfold. For Soviet soldiers, many of whom had witnessed the devastation that Nazi Germany had inflicted on their homeland, the advance into Germany itself carried profound emotional weight. Officers reported that soldiers were motivated by a fierce desire to bring the war to an end and to exact retribution for years of suffering. At the same time, Soviet military discipline and the presence of commissars ensured that this motivation remained channeled toward military objectives rather than dissolving into uncontrolled violence. German defenders, by contrast, faced the psychological burden of fighting a war they knew was lost. Some fought with fanatic determination, inspired by loyalty to Hitler or ideological commitment to National Socialism. Others fought because they had no choice, because retreat was considered worse than death, because orders were orders. Many fought because they were young and afraid, and had not yet fully comprehended the magnitude of what was happening around them. The human dimensions of the offensive, the fears, the calculations, the desperate hopes, played out against a backdrop of massive military machinery grinding relentlessly forward. In the days immediately following the initial Soviet breakthrough, the outer suburbs of Berlin began to experience the reality of proximity to the front lines. Artillery fire, initially distant, grew progressively closer as Soviet forces advanced. Refugees fleeing from the advancing Soviets clogged roads leading westward, creating scenes of chaos and desperation. Civilian casualties began to mount as bombing and artillery fire intensified. The infrastructure of the city, transportation networks, communication systems, water and power supplies, began to break down under the strain of bombardment and the demands of military operations. The normal functions of urban life ceased to exist. Hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers and injured civilians. Food distribution systems, already strained by years of war, collapsed entirely. The psychological reality began to crystallize among Berlin's population. The war was not coming to Berlin. The war had already arrived. The Soviet offensive that began on the 16th of April in 1945 set in motion a chain of events that would lead inexorably to the fall of Berlin within 2 weeks. The breakthrough at the Oder, the collapse of German defenses at the Seelow Heights, and the rapid advance of Soviet mechanized formations into German territory demonstrated that the German Reich had exhausted its capacity for effective defense. What remained now was not a question of whether Berlin would fall, but rather the sequence of suffering and destruction that would accompany its fall. The scale of the Soviet assault, the determination of Soviet commanders, and the systematic destruction of German defensive capability all pointed toward a conclusion that was already written in blood and fire. The city that had symbolized Nazi power and ambition was about to experience the full weight of Soviet vengeance and military might. The opening barrage at 0430 on the morning of the 16th of April was not merely the beginning of an assault on Berlin. It was the beginning of the end of an era and the birth of a new reality for Europe and the world. The Soviet artillery bombardment that began on the 16th of April had pulverized the outer defenses, but it had not broken the will of Berlin's defenders. As the main assault columns of the Red Army pushed through the breached lines at the Oder, they encountered a new kind of resistance, not the organized, disciplined defense of a functioning military, but the desperate, scattered, and often fanatical stand of soldiers who knew they were fighting for their lives in the rubble of their own capital. The outer districts of Berlin, Köpenick to the southeast, Spandau to the northwest, Lichtenberg to the east, became the first proving ground for urban warfare on a scale that Europe had rarely witnessed. Soviet commanders had trained their troops for this eventuality, but no amount of preparation could fully account for what awaited them. A city transformed into a fortress, street by street, building by building, cellar by cellar. The German defenders, though scattered and often poorly coordinated, possessed one overwhelming advantage in these early days of the street fighting. They knew the terrain intimately, and they had months to prepare their positions. What followed was not a rapid Soviet march to victory, but rather a grinding, attritional campaign that would consume thousands of lives and reduce entire neighborhoods to rubble and ash. Soviet tank columns spearheaded the initial push into Berlin's outer ring, their T-34 and Stalin tanks rolling down wide avenues that had once been lined with Nazi flags and cheering crowds. The infantry followed closely behind, moving in coordinated squads that had been hardened by 4 years of continuous combat against the Wehrmacht. But almost immediately, the tanks encountered resistance that slowed their advance to a crawl. German anti-tank teams, armed with Panzerfausts, short-range, single-use weapons devastatingly effective in urban terrain, waited in the rubble and struck from windows and doorways. A Soviet tank commander who survived the early fighting would later describe the experience of moving through these outer districts as akin to entering a nightmare. The streets were narrow enough that tanks could be ambushed from multiple angles simultaneously, and the buildings that lined every avenue provided endless hiding places for desperate defenders. The Soviet crews learned quickly that armor alone could not take a city. they needed infantry to clear buildings, and that infantry would have to do so without the protection of steel. This realization set the tempo for what would become the defining characteristic of the Berlin campaign: methodical, savage, and enormously costly street-by-street clearing operations. The fighting in Köpenick, on the southern outskirts, exemplified this brutal dynamic. Soviet forces crossed into the district on the 17th of April, expecting rapid progress given the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Red Army. Instead, they found themselves moving through a world of prepared positions: rubble walls constructed from bombed-out buildings, trenches dug in parks and open spaces, anti-tank guns positioned at street intersections to create interlocking fields of fire. German defenders, a mixture of Wehrmacht regulars and SS units hardened in combat, fought from fortified positions and made the Soviets pay for every meter of ground. Soviet commanders responded by calling in artillery and ground attack aircraft to suppress German positions, but in a dense urban environment, artillery fire that was meant to destroy enemy fortifications often obliterated entire city blocks, killing defenders and civilians alike without significantly accelerating the Soviet advance. Infantry would assault a position, take it at great cost, only to find that the next position, 2 or 3 buildings away, was equally well prepared and equally determined to resist. The pace of advance in Köpenick, despite Soviet numerical superiority, averaged less than 1 kilometer per day during the heaviest fighting, a glacial pace measured against the speed at which the Red Army had crossed open terrain just weeks before. What the Soviet soldiers discovered as they pressed deeper into Berlin's residential districts was that the German defenders, though scattered, had become extraordinarily skilled at converting urban terrain into killing zones. Buildings that might have seemed damaged or semi-ruined on approach often contained carefully prepared firing positions, machine gunners positioned to sweep corridors and courtyards, anti-tank guns placed to cover street intersections, snipers stationed in upper floors with clear sightlines down thoroughfares. German defenders would establish a primary position, and when Soviet forces pressed against it, they would fall back to a secondary position already prepared just behind, drawing the attackers into a web of interlocking fire. Some of the fiercest fighting occurred in the Lichtenberg district in the east, where German units under the command of experienced officers fought a disciplined withdrawal that inflicted heavy casualties on Soviet forces pursuing them. Soviet accounts describe having to call in artillery strikes so intense that the ground itself seemed to shake before infantry could advance into positions that had been occupied only moments before. Entire blocks were reduced to rubble, not by design, but as a consequence of the industrial scale of firepower required to dislodge defenders who had nothing left to lose. The human cost of this grinding urban campaign became apparent almost immediately. Soviet soldiers, many of them conscripts with limited training in urban combat, suffered casualty rates in Berlin that exceeded even those of the final offensives in open terrain. A single city block might require 3 or 4 assaults before it was finally secured, and each assault cost lives. Men killed by machine gun fire while crossing open streets, men killed by grenades thrown from windows, men killed by anti-tank weapons that could destroy armor and scatter soldiers in a single devastating moment. Soviet field hospitals became overwhelmed with wounded, men missing limbs, men blinded by explosions, men suffering from severe shock and psychological trauma. The Soviet command, however, viewed the urban campaign through the lens of overall strategic victory. What mattered was that the Red Army continued to advance, continued to press toward the German government district, continued to drive the Nazis back toward their final defeat. Individual casualties, however heavy, were acceptable when weighed against the prize of Berlin itself. This cold calculation meant that Soviet commanders, facing resistance in the rubble, would order new assaults where an American or British commander might have paused to regroup or sought another route. By the 18th of April, Soviet forces had pushed into the outer districts along a front more than 40 kilometers wide, and the character of the battle had fundamentally shifted from a conventional military campaign to something far more brutal and attritional. German defenders, though increasingly desperate, maintained morale through a combination of propaganda, leadership, and the simple fact that they were fighting for survival. Officers and ideological commissars circulated among the troops, reminding them that Soviet victory would mean occupation, that Soviet soldiers had been told stories of German atrocities on the Eastern Front, some true, some exaggerated, and that surrender would likely mean death rather than imprisonment. Many German defenders were SS men or Hitler Youth who had been indoctrinated into fanaticism from childhood and who, having committed themselves to Nazi ideology or feared what would happen if they surrendered to Soviet forces, chose to fight to the end. But there were also ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers who simply took up defensive positions because they had been ordered to do so, who dug into cellars and rubble because it was their duty, and who continued to resist even as they became increasingly aware that the war was lost. What made the German defense dangerous was not that it was coordinated at the highest level. By this point, coordination had broken down almost entirely, but that it was distributed across thousands of small positions, each defended by men willing to inflict casualties on Soviet attackers. This decentralized defense meant that the Soviet advance, though seemingly overwhelming in terms of raw numbers, had to be earned block by block, position by position. Soviet commanders adapted their tactics as they learned the lessons of urban warfare. Rather than frontal assaults down wide avenues where tanks could be ambushed and infantry could be pinned, Soviet forces began using side streets and alleys, approaching German positions from multiple directions to avoid concentrating forces where they could be hit by enfilade fire. Engineers with demolition charges accompanied assault groups, collapsing buildings on top of defenders or creating new routes through walls that would have been defended from the street. Flamethrower teams, viewed with particular terror by German defenders, advanced behind infantry to burn out positions in cellars and basements. Soviet artillery, which had been the dominant weapon in the open field battles of the previous weeks, became less useful in the tight urban terrain, where the distances between attacker and defender were measured in tens of meters rather than kilometers. What emerged was a grinding, hand-to-hand combat campaign that relied on discipline, combined arms coordination at the squad and platoon level, and a willingness on the part of Soviet commanders to accept casualties as the cost of progress. By the 19th of April, after just 3 days of serious street fighting, Soviet forces had advanced into the inner suburbs and reached the outskirts of districts that would directly overlook the German government quarter. The civilian population of Berlin, huddled in cellars and bunkers, experienced the street fighting as an apocalyptic event. Apartments and houses that had survived the aerial bombing campaign, many of them in these outer districts, were now reduced to rubble by artillery fire, tank fire, and the inevitable destruction that accompanied urban combat. Families sheltering in cellars could hear the sounds of fighting directly above them: machine gun fire, explosions, the roar of tank engines, and had no way of knowing whether the next moment would bring Soviet soldiers, German counterattacks, or simply more bombardment. Some cellars were hit directly by artillery, burying the families inside under tons of brick and concrete. Others became prisons when buildings collapsed and sealed the entrances, trapping residents underground without water, food, or sanitation for days until rescue crews could dig them out. The collapse of normal life was absolute. No electricity, no running water, no food distribution, no medical services. Mothers improvised bandages from cloth. Fathers rationed whatever supplies they had managed to store, and children learned the patterns of fighting the way peacetime children learned the patterns of school and play. The street fighting meant that Berlin's outer districts, which had been home to hundreds of thousands of civilians, became a depopulated hellscape of rubble and fire within days. Survivors would later describe the experience as witnessing the end of the world itself. By the 20th of April, Soviet forces had consolidated control of much of Berlin's eastern and southern suburbs and were preparing for the assault on the city centre. The fighting in the outer districts had achieved its strategic purpose. The Red Army was now positioned to strike at the heart of Nazi Germany, but it had done so at tremendous cost. Soviet losses in the first 5 days of street fighting were estimated at tens of thousands of killed and wounded. German losses were comparable in proportion to their smaller numbers, with entire units destroyed or rendered combat ineffective. The world of Berlin, from the perspective of someone standing on high ground looking back at the outer districts, was one of almost total devastation. Whole neighborhoods that had existed just days before, with apartment buildings, shops, small parks, had been transformed into seas of rubble, punctuated by the skeletal remains of buildings too damaged to stand. Smoke hung over the city in layers, thin in some places where burning had subsided, thick and black in others where fires were still consuming what remained of wooden structures. The smell, survivors would remember, was overwhelming, a combination of explosives residue, burning fuel, and the stench of death that persisted for months after the fighting ended. What had been a city of 3 million people was now a battlefield where perhaps 2 million civilians still huddled in whatever shelter they could find, and where every hour brought new destruction and new death. The character of the combat itself reflected the desperation of both sides. Soviet soldiers, having advanced hundreds of kilometers across open terrain, suddenly found themselves in close-quarters combat, where the superior organization and firepower that had served them so well in conventional warfare provided less advantage. German defenders, knowing they faced annihilation if they surrendered to Soviet forces, fought with a ferocity that sometimes bordered on suicidal. There were instances of German units holding streets and buildings against repeated Soviet assaults, inflicting casualties that would have broken most conventional defenses, before being finally overwhelmed by sheer weight of numbers. There were also instances of Soviet soldiers, frustrated by the slow pace of advance and enraged by what they understood about German atrocities on the Eastern Front, executing German prisoners and civilians in acts of revenge that would later become part of the historical record and part of the Soviet narrative about the justice of their victory. The street fighting was not heroic or glorious. It was savage and brutal, and it reduced human beings to their basest instincts. Survival became the only meaningful measure of success, and both Soviet soldiers and German defenders, in the rubble-strewn districts of Berlin, understood that survival meant killing everything that stood in their way before it could kill them. As the outer districts fell into Soviet hands over the course of late April, the intensity of fighting did not diminish. It simply moved closer to the center of the city. Each conquered neighborhood brought Soviet forces deeper into Berlin's infrastructure, closer to the government quarter, closer to the bunker where Hitler remained isolated from reality and cut off from meaningful communication with his armies. German defenders, far from being demoralized by the loss of the outer districts, used each captured neighborhood as preparation for the next defensive stand. The rubble of the outer suburbs became the template for preparing the inner city. Obstacles placed, positions established, fields of fire identified. The momentum of the Soviet advance was real and inexorable, but it was purchased with blood at every meter. The fighting in Berlin's outer districts established the pattern that would define the rest of the campaign. Systematic, grinding, attritional Soviet offensives against desperate but increasingly isolated German defenses. What had once been a city was becoming a military objective measured only in territory controlled and enemies killed. The people who inhabited Berlin, both soldiers and civilians, were simply the incidental cost of war at its most terrible and most complete. Beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin lies a bunker complex that by April 1945 had become less a command center and more a sealed tomb. Constructed across multiple levels deep underground, this fortress of concrete and steel was designed to protect the Nazi leadership from bombing and assault. The bunker system included the Führerbunker itself, Hitler's personal quarters, connected by tunnels to the larger Vorbunker, where staff and guards were billeted. Electric lights burned constantly in the windowless passages, creating an artificial perpetual night that disconnected inhabitants from the passage of time above. The air grew thick and stale, recycled by ventilation systems that struggled under the weight of too many bodies in too small a space. Here, surrounded by guards and aides, Adolf Hitler spent his final weeks issuing orders to phantom armies and contemplating the end of everything he had built. By mid-April 1945, when the Red Army stood at the gates of Berlin, the information reaching the bunker had become almost entirely disconnected from military reality. Messengers and military liaison officers brought reports that Hitler and his closest advisors selected or reinterpreted according to their needs, filtering out inconvenient truths and amplifying wishful thinking. The Führer believed that the divisions mentioned in the daily briefings still existed, that General Wenck's 12th Army would arrive from the south to relieve Berlin, that General Steiner's forces would mount a counter-offensive in the north, that wonder weapons would turn the tide at the last moment. These armies existed only in Hitler's imagination, yet he ordered operations based on their phantom strength. Junior officers and generals who attempted to inform him that such units had been destroyed or scattered were met with accusations of defeatism, cowardice, or betrayal. The bunker had become a place where hope and delusion were the only currencies that mattered, and reality was treated as an inconvenience. The atmosphere inside grew increasingly oppressive as the days wore on and the thunder of Soviet artillery drew closer. Soldiers stationed in the bunker reported a suffocating tension. The knowledge that the war was lost combined with the absolute prohibition against voicing such thoughts aloud. Hitler's mood swung between manic bursts of energy, during which he would study maps and issue rapid-fire orders, and periods of depression in which he would sit silent for hours, occasionally muttering about betrayals. His personal physicians pumped him full of medications, stimulants, sedatives, pain relievers, that further clouded his judgment and detached him from the actual world above. The medical treatments became a metaphor for the bunker itself, artificial means of maintaining a fiction of strength and control when the body, both Hitler's and the Reich's, was dying. Even those closest to him began to recognize the signs of a man whose mind was fragmenting under the weight of catastrophic failure. Among Hitler's inner circle, a strange dynamic emerged between those who clung to delusion and those who recognized the truth but felt powerless to change the course. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels, who occupied rooms in the bunker with his family, remained utterly committed to the Nazi cause, even as he accepted privately that defeat was inevitable. Chief of Staff Hans Krebs continued to file military reports with meticulous precision, maintaining the fiction of an organized defense, even as units dissolved into chaos. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, warned Hitler of the coming end. But even his warnings were met with denial and accusations that he lacked faith. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop drifted through the corridors, offering vague diplomatic schemes that everyone understood were fantasies. General Alfred Jodl, the chief of operations, grew visibly older day by day, haunted by the knowledge that the orders he transmitted were sending men to pointless deaths. The bunker housed men who possessed vastly different understandings of the situation, yet they remained locked together in concrete and steel, unable or unwilling to escape. The loyalty that bound these men to Hitler, whether born of genuine belief, fear of consequences, or simple lack of alternatives, proved stronger than any impulse toward rational surrender. Many of them had served in the Nazi regime for years or even decades, their identities fused with the organization they served. To abandon Hitler would mean abandoning everything they had worked for, everything they had become. For some, there was also the knowledge that surrender would likely mean trials, imprisonment, or execution for war crimes. The bunker had become a place where escape was impossible and surrender was unthinkable, where the only path forward seemed to be to continue the fiction until the very end. Even men who despised Hitler or who saw clearly that the war could not be won found themselves bound by ties of habit, hierarchy, and fear. The bunker enforced a terrible conformity. Outward support for Hitler's decisions and denial of reality became survival mechanisms. The separation between the bunker and the world above grew more complete with each passing day. Those in the command center depended on messengers, radio reports, and occasional telephone calls to understand what was happening in the city above them. Soviet shells began landing closer, shaking the concrete above their heads, a physical manifestation of how close the enemy had come. The sound grew from a distant rumble to a constant percussion that made sleep nearly impossible. When messengers arrived from above, with reports of entire city blocks engulfed in flames, or news that German defensive positions had collapsed, the bunker's inhabitants struggled to reconcile these accounts with Hitler's confidence in victory. Some information was simply not passed along to the Führer, because officers knew it would provoke a rage or an inappropriate response. This created an information crisis, where the most powerful man in the bunker was among the least informed about the true state of affairs. The bunker became a place where communication itself broke down, where truth was filtered through so many layers of fear and denial that it barely resembled reality by the time it reached Hitler's ears. The plans made in the bunker during these final days ranged from the grandiose to the suicidal, often without clear distinction between the two categories. Hitler issued orders for the destruction of Berlin's infrastructure, its bridges, power plants, and water systems, to prevent the city from falling into Soviet hands as a functioning capital. He mandated that any officer who suggested withdrawal should be shot immediately, creating a climate where military judgment had to be subordinated to political decree. He dismissed and condemned generals who reported the truth, yet their replacements proved no more capable of reversing the tide of defeat. Hitler even drew up plans for a fortress Berlin that would hold out indefinitely, despite the mathematical impossibility of defending a city being surrounded by millions of Soviet troops with overwhelming firepower. Each plan was transmitted upward to officers in the field, who received orders to defend positions that had already been overrun, or to move armies that had ceased to exist as coherent units. The bunker was manufacturing orders that could not be executed, sending men to defend impossible positions, manufacturing the illusion of command authority when actual command had long since dissolved. Hitler's contemplation of his own fate during these days became increasingly explicit and obsessive. He spoke openly about suicide, about the fates of previous leaders who had fallen into enemy hands, about the ignominious deaths he was determined to avoid. He questioned his closest aides about methods and timing, making it clear that capture by Soviet forces was absolutely unacceptable to him. He expressed a wish to have his body destroyed after death, ensuring that the Red Army would not be able to display or desecrate his remains. These conversations carried a grim finality. Hitler was no longer making plans for survival, or even for continued resistance, but rather planning his exit. Some historians see in this obsession evidence that even Hitler, in his heart, recognized that the end had come. Yet even as he contemplated his own death, he demanded that others continue fighting, that Berlin be held, that the struggle go on. The man who had once inspired millions with visions of a 1,000-year Reich was now focused only on the precise manner in which he would leave it. The other inhabitants of the bunker began making their own preparations for the end, though often in different directions than Hitler's. Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer of the SS and architect of the Holocaust, secretly attempted to negotiate a surrender with the Swedish Red Cross without Hitler's knowledge, though these negotiations led nowhere. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, attempted to leave Berlin and head south, only to be stripped of his positions for what Hitler viewed as an act of disloyalty. Other senior officials made plans for escape, attempting to liquidate assets or arrange clandestine routes out of the city. The bunker became a place of competing agendas, where men nominally loyal to Hitler were simultaneously hedging their bets and attempting to secure their own futures. Yet none of them could leave. The bunker's security prevented unauthorized departures, and loyalty oaths bound them to the regime, even as the regime crumbled. The escape attempts and negotiations that occurred were either thwarted or kept secret from Hitler, adding to the layers of deception and hidden communication within the command center. The psychological effect of being sealed in the bunker day after day, hearing the artillery grow ever closer, without any realistic prospect of victory or escape, wore on the inhabitants in ways that manifested in symptoms of breakdown and despair. Sleep became nearly impossible despite the medication offered to induce it. Food, though better provisioned than the rations available to ordinary Berliners, lost its taste and appeal. Some officers spoke obsessively about imagined rescue scenarios that everyone knew were impossible. Others grew numb, existing in a state of passive acceptance of the inevitable. The bunker, designed as a refuge, became a place of psychological torture, a prison where the guards were as trapped as the prisoners, where the commander was as much a captive as anyone else. Rumors circulated through the corridors about who might attempt an escape, who might betray Hitler, what the Soviets would do when they broke through. The tension was nearly unbearable because it combined complete helplessness with the knowledge that the catastrophe was approaching with inexorable certainty. The contrast between the world above and the world below became almost surreal as the final days approached. In the bunker, Hitler could still convene military conferences and issue orders as though he controlled vast armies and resources. In the ruins above, those same orders were being relayed to soldiers fighting and dying in the wreckage of a city that no longer resembled a functioning human settlement. The bunker remained clean and organized and supplied with electricity and water, while above ground, people huddled in cellars, drinking contaminated water and eating whatever scraps they could find. The bunker's inhabitants debated strategy and issued tactical directives, while the soldiers trying to execute them had no ammunition, no supplies, and no realistic chance of success. This schism between the bunker's perception of reality and the actual reality playing out in the ruins above was perhaps the bunker's most damning characteristic. It allowed Hitler and his inner circle to maintain their delusions even as those delusions cost thousands of lives. The bunker was not just a physical structure, but a metaphor for the entire Nazi regime, a fantasy constructed in defiance of reality, maintained through force and fear, collapsing slowly under the weight of truths it could no longer deny. As Soviet artillery rounds landed closer and the walls of the bunker itself began to shake, the realization spread through the complex that the end was not merely approaching, but imminent. Yet still the meetings continued, still the orders were issued, still the fiction was maintained. Officers who had once believed unquestioningly in the Führer now found themselves capable only of following orders because the psychological weight of the bunker's sealed isolation had become unbearable. The bunker had accomplished what no external force could fully accomplish. It had isolated Hitler from reality while simultaneously trapping him in a prison from which there was no escape. The walls that were supposed to protect him had become walls that confined him, and the loyalty that had kept him in power had become a cage that prevented him from accepting the only rational course. In the depths of the bunker, as the Red Army drew ever closer, Hitler remained, ordering phantom armies, contemplating his death, convinced of his rightness, even as the world above burned and the world below became his tomb. In the cellars beneath Berlin, families huddle in darkness that had become their refuge and their prison. The bombardment above continues without mercy, a relentless percussion that shakes dust from concrete walls and sends tremors through the bodies of those sheltering below. A mother holds her children close, whispering assurances she does not believe while overhead, Soviet artillery reduces the city into rubble. These underground spaces, basements, subway tunnels, bunkers hastily reinforced with sandbags and wooden beams, have become the new geography of survival for more than 2 million trapped Berliners. They are crowded beyond reason, often more than 100 people pressed into chambers designed for a fraction that number. Air is thin, the smell of human waste and unwashed bodies mingles with the acrid sting of brick dust. Sleep comes in fragments, interrupted by the screech of falling shells and the groans of the wounded. Here, in these suffocating depths, time loses meaning. Hours blur into days, and the outside world becomes increasingly theoretical, known only through the sounds of destruction filtering down through the rubble above. The collapse of supply lines transformed scarcity into famine. Within days of the Soviet offensive's opening barrage on the 16th of April, the mechanisms that had kept Berlin fed, already strained by years of war, simply ceased to function. Bakeries closed as their stocks of flour ran out, and no delivery trucks arrived to replenish them. Butchers' shops emptied as the last reserves of meat were rationed to the military. The water system, damaged by bombardment, no longer delivered water reliably to many neighborhoods. What little food remained was distributed through hastily organized emergency rations that grew smaller each day. A family might receive a portion of black bread and a thin soup made from whatever could be found. Turnips, chestnuts, sometimes nothing more than hot water flavored with bouillon. Children received slightly larger shares in theory, though mothers often gave their own portions to their young. The elderly and the sick, already weakened, began to fail. In the cellars, people sat in semi-darkness, conserving energy, their conversations becoming quieter as hunger drained them of vitality. Thieves moved through the shelters at night, stealing ration cards, small caches of food, anything that might extend survival another day. The psychological weight of watching your child grow hollow-eyed from hunger proved as devastating as the physical reality of starvation itself. The breakdown of civil order transformed fear of enemy bombardment into a more diffuse and personal terror. Police disappeared as the city's administrative structure collapsed, replaced by SS fanatics and improvised military tribunals that executed deserters and defeatists with casual brutality. Gangs looted abandoned homes and shops, searching for food, valuables, or simply anything to occupy themselves in the chaos. The Hitler Youth, many of them fanatical boys barely old enough to shave, were given authority and weapons, and some used this power with the cruelty of the desperate and indoctrinated. Rumors spread through the cellars like contagion. The Soviets were murdering all German men they found. They were coming to enslave the women. The communists would burn Berlin to ash. Some rumors carried fragments of truth. Others were pure terror born from propaganda and the natural human mind seeking explanations for catastrophe. Neighbor turned against neighbor out of fear or suspicion. A careless word overheard could result in denunciation to the authorities still hunting for defeatists. Trust evaporated. Within the cellars, families increasingly kept to themselves, wary of those around them. The social bonds that had held civilian society together, already frayed by years of totalitarian control and constant surveillance, snapped completely under the pressure of siege. Above ground, entire neighborhoods were erased in hours. Soviet artillery, concentrated in unprecedented density along the breakthrough sectors, transformed city blocks into fields of rubble and flame. The Friedrichshain district, densely populated with workers' housing, was pounded into submission so completely that whole streets became indistinguishable from one another, nothing but shattered brick, twisted metal, and the detritus of buildings that had stood for decades. When Soviet ground forces swept through these ruins, they moved methodically, clearing each structure, each cellar, sometimes encountering German defenders, sometimes finding only civilians cowering in fear. The apartment blocks where families had lived their entire lives were reduced to walls 3 meters high, windows blown inward, rooms exposed to the elements like a grotesque dollhouse. Entire families were buried in collapses, sometimes dug out days later by survivors searching desperately for their loved ones. The Tiergarten, the vast green space at Berlin's heart, was torn open by shells and transformed into a world of splintered trees and bomb craters. In the Kurfürstendamm, the elegant boulevard that had once been the symbol of Berlin's sophistication, fires burned in the upper floors of buildings, smoke billowing into a sky that had turned perpetually dark with ash and dust. The destruction was systematic, overwhelming, complete. Within the cellars, the sounds of this devastation became a constant presence that no one ever grew accustomed to. The whistle of incoming shells, a sound that started faint and rose to an unbearable shriek before the explosion, sent people diving to the floor even though they were safe underground, a purely instinctual response to a danger they could hear but not escape. The impacts above shook the entire structure, sending small cascades of dust and plaster sifting down from the ceiling onto the faces and bodies of those below. Some shells hit close enough to crack walls or bring down sections of the ceiling, burying people in tons of rubble, and the screams that followed were worse than the shells themselves. Conversations in the cellars became clipped, almost mechanical. People spoke only when necessary, and even then, in hushed tones, as if loud voices might somehow draw the artillery's attention. Children, traumatized beyond their capacity to process trauma, often sat in stunned silence for hours at a time. Some children stopped speaking entirely for days or weeks, their minds retreating from a reality they could not comprehend. The elderly sometimes seemed almost indifferent to the bombardment, having lived through so much already that death itself seemed like merely another transition. Women knitted or tried to sew, occupying their hands to still their minds. Men stood guard, watching the entrances to cellars and the stairwells, maintaining some fiction of order and protection even when everyone knew protection was impossible. Sanitation in the cellars deteriorated until disease became as real a threat as bombardment. Toilets, never adequate even in peacetime, became unusable as the water system failed and waste accumulated. Dysentery spread through the shelters, striking down children and the elderly first, then indiscriminately through the population. The smell became overwhelming, a mixture of human excrement, sweat, blood, and decay that seemed to coat the throat and seep into clothing and hair. Medical care was virtually non-existent. A few doctors remained in the city, moving between cellars offering what help they could with no medicines, no bandages, no resources beyond their knowledge and experience. Wounds became infected. Infections became gangrene. Amputations were performed without anesthesia in candle-lit basement corners, with the patient biting down on a piece of wood while neighbors held them down. Mothers gave birth in darkness, assisted by older women or midwives who did what they could with no hot water, no clean supplies, and the constant fear that the bombardment would resume at the moment of greatest vulnerability. Newborns cried in hunger, and there was no milk for them, no formula, nothing but the pale desperation of mothers unable to feed their own children. Miscarriages were frequent, stillbirths common. In one cellar, a woman died giving birth, and her body remained in the corner for 2 days because no one had the strength or emotional resources to move her. The living stepped carefully around the dead, and life and death existed in the same space, separated only by a few meters and the invisible boundary of the still beating heart. Psychological breakdown was gradual and relentless. A woman who had kept her composure through weeks of bombardment might suddenly begin to laugh uncontrollably at something minor, or weep for hours at a small loss that under normal circumstances would have been unremarkable. Men who had been the protectors and providers of their families found themselves helpless, unable to feed, protect, or comfort anyone. Some retreated into themselves entirely, becoming almost catatonic, staring at nothing for entire days. Others became hypervigilant and aggressive, snapping at family members over imagined slights, their nervous systems so wound tight that any unexpected sound sent them into defensive rage. Suicide was more common than anyone later wanted to admit. Some people, unable to bear the uncertainty and the suffering any longer, would slip away from the group and take their own lives, often with cyanide pills that had been distributed to the civilian population as part of the desperate preparation for Soviet occupation. Others talked about it constantly, planning it, almost rehearsing it, using suicide as a way of asserting some last vestige of control over their fate. For many, the terror of what the Soviets might do when they arrived was as overwhelming as the bombardment itself, and death seemed preferable to capture. The propaganda had done its work well. Stories of Soviet atrocities in Poland and Eastern Germany, some true, some exaggerated, some invented, spread through the cellars like a virus, and they combined with the natural human tendency to fear the unknown and the enemy to create a kind of mass anticipatory terror that sometimes exceeded the immediate physical threat. Stories of survival, small and large, emerged from the darkness. A baker managed to maintain a tiny operation in a cellar, baking small loaves from flour he had hidden away months earlier, providing not just calories, but also a thread of normalcy and purpose that kept him and those around him psychologically anchored. A nurse moved through the cellars without stopping, tending the sick with a devotion that bordered on the religious, her presence alone seeming to comfort people who knew she could do little for them medically. Children created games from the rubble, finding bits of metal to play with, constructing imaginary worlds in the shadows of the basement, their resilience and adaptability sometimes shocking the adults who watched them. Strangers who met in the cellars and became bonded through shared trauma often remained as close as family for the rest of their lives, the experience of surviving the siege creating connections that transcended normal social bonds. Food was shared, rationed, guarded, sometimes jealously, sometimes with unexpected generosity. A woman who had almost nothing gave some of her ration to a child she did not know, and the act of generosity, small and insignificant in any normal context, felt revolutionary in the context of starvation. An elderly man who had fought in the First World War kept the spirits of those around him with stories and jokes, helping them endure through laughter even as shells fell above. These small acts of resistance, of humanity maintained against the odds, were the true victories within the cellars, more powerful in their way than any military triumph. The passage of time became distorted and unreliable. Days bled into one another until people lost track of dates, knowing only that it was still April, still the siege, still the waiting. Some people marked time by the intensity of the bombardment, others by when they last received food, others by physical symptoms of illness or starvation. A mother who had kept careful count of days to track her children's ages eventually gave up, unable to maintain the mental discipline of numbering when everything else was chaos. Watches and clocks stopped, either broken by vibrations or running down without winding, and many people stopped trying to repair them. Time became visceral rather than measured in heartbeats during the loudest bombardments, in hours of thirst when water was cut off, in the deepening weakness of the body as rations shrank. For the children born into this siege, who had no memory of normal life, the cellar and the bombardment became the entire world, a baseline against which nothing else could be compared. Those who had lived through normal Berlin, who remembered sunlight and shops and the smell of bread without hunger, found the contrast unbearable sometimes. Nostalgia and present trauma mixed together into something almost psychedelic, memories seeming as unreal as dreams. Some people found comfort in reminiscing about the old Berlin. Others found it unbearable and asked others not to speak of it. The past became a country from which no return was possible. The Red Army's progress, tracked through the sounds and the rumors in the cellars, created a temporal paradox. People desperately wanted the siege to end, knowing that only the complete victory of Soviet forces would bring the bombardment to a halt. Yet they also dreaded that same victory, fearing what Soviet soldiers might do when they entered the cellars. This created a strange limbo where the worst threat and the source of hope were one and the same. As Soviet forces pushed deeper into Berlin, the sounds of small arms fire began to mix with the artillery bombardment, the sharp crack of rifles and machine guns, closer and closer. Occasionally, someone in the cellar would press an ear to a crack or opening and report back what they heard. Tank engines, shouted orders in Russian, the sound of buildings collapsing from tank fire or grenades. The walls themselves seemed to vibrate with approaching victory, and no one could decide if that was good news or catastrophe. Some people prayed to God, whom they had long ago abandoned. Some people prayed to Stalin, seeing him as a savior. Most people simply waited, unable to do anything but endure, trapped between two armies, with no choice but to see the siege through to whatever end awaited them. Families fractured under the strain even as they clung to one another. A husband and wife who had survived decades together found themselves unable to speak by the second week of the siege, having exhausted every possible conversation and now sitting in silence because words only reminded them of things they could not do or have. Adult children who had moved away before the war came back to shelter with their parents, only to find that the people they remembered had been replaced by shadows who looked similar but thought and felt like strangers. The bond between parent and child, perhaps the strongest bond in human nature, often held stronger than marriages or friendships. A mother would literally give every remaining ounce of her life to her child, but the guilt of being unable to properly feed or protect that child sometimes overwhelmed even the maternal instinct. Arguments broke out over tiny allocations of food, over sleeping positions in overcrowded cellars, over perceived slights that would have been forgiven in normal circumstances but felt like betrayals in the pressure cooker of siege. Yet these same families would also move heaven and earth for each other, would share secrets they had never told anyone else, would sit together in the darkness and feel a profound sense of connection to the people they loved, knowing that either they would survive together or they would fall together. The siege. By the 23rd of April 1945, Berlin had become a city of ruins within ruins. The outer rings had fallen. The suburbs that once held 500,000 souls now served as graveyards of concrete and steel. Soviet forces had torn through the eastern and northeastern approaches with methodical brutality, and now the Red Army stood poised at the city's threshold, ready to plunge deeper into the heart of the capital. The Wehrmacht's defensive lines, which had held for nearly a week, had begun to fray into disconnected pockets of resistance, scattered across the urban landscape like embers in cooling ash. German commanders knew what was coming. They could feel it in the vibration of artillery that never ceased, in the smoke that hung perpetually over the rooftops, in the knowledge that millions of Soviet soldiers now pressed against the city's edge. The center, the prize, the government district where power had reigned for 12 years, was no longer distant. It was near. What remained of German military organization in Berlin was fragmenting into desperate, localized battles. Army Group Vistula, once a commanding structure under General Gotthard Heinrici, had lost coherence as Soviet forces encircled it. Communication between units broke down as telephone lines were severed by artillery, as radio frequencies became unreliable, as officers found themselves isolated in their own sectors. Some Wehrmacht commanders attempted to coordinate last-stand operations. Others simply tried to preserve their men through another night. The Hitler Youth, those boys who had been conscripted into the Volkssturm, the People's Storm, a militia of the elderly, the infirm, and children barely old enough to hold a rifle, were being thrown into the meat grinder alongside exhausted regulars and SS fanatics who had nowhere else to retreat. These young soldiers, some no more than 14 or 15 years old, had been trained for weeks in propaganda halls and drafted into trenches where they faced experienced Soviet assault groups armed with submachine guns and grenades. Many died before they understood how to operate their weapons. Others died defiant, drugged on ideology and fear. The asymmetry was absolute. The Soviet strategy into central Berlin was not subtle. It was a sledgehammer approach that accepted casualties as a cost of speed. Marshal Zhukov's forces had been organized into multiple assault fronts, each driving wedges into the city from different directions. Artillery bombardment continued to precede each advance, pounding block after block into submission before infantry moved forward through the rubble. Tank support, crucial in urban fighting, moved up the widest streets and avenues, their guns providing fire support while infantry fanned out through the buildings. The Red Army had learned urban combat through the devastation of Warsaw, the slow grinding conquest of East Prussian cities, and the street-by-street battle for Budapest. Berlin would be no different in method, only more intense, because this was the capital, because this was the prize, because this was where it would all end. Soviet soldiers knew they were fighting toward the bunker beneath the Chancellery. They knew Hitler was down there somewhere. They advanced with the knowledge that every block conquered brought them closer to the dictator who had invaded their homeland and killed their families. In the government district itself, the architecture changed. Here were massive stone buildings, grand ministries, and administration complexes designed to project power and permanence. The Chancellery, that enormous neoclassical structure where Hitler had conducted the affairs of the Reich, became a fortress. Barricades had been erected around it. Anti-tank obstacles lined the surrounding streets. Machine gun nests were positioned in the upper floors of nearby buildings. Hitler himself remained below ground, in the bunker complex known as the Führerbunker, a claustrophobic warren of concrete tunnels and reinforced rooms that ran beneath the Chancellery and the Reich Chancellery Garden. Above ground, German troops made their stand. Above ground, they prepared to die for a leader who would not show his face. Soldiers moved through the rubble in small groups, knowing that Soviet assault squads operated with similar tactics. Every entrance to every building was a potential ambush. Every intersection was a killing ground. The fighting here was close, brutal, and utterly without mercy on either side. German counterattacks still occurred, but they grew more desperate and less coordinated. At one point, late in April, German forces attempted to break the Soviet encirclement to the west, hoping to link up with American forces and establish some sort of negotiated surrender. The operation failed almost immediately. Soviet forces had sealed the encirclement too tightly, positioned their armor too densely, and committed reserves too quickly to allow any breakthrough. German commanders watched their available reserves, panzer units that once would have seemed formidable, but were now scattered, undermanned, and running low on fuel, get chewed up in failed assaults. Each failure reduced the capacity for the next attempt. Each failed counterattack meant more soldiers dead, more officers lost, more cohesion destroyed. The Wehrmacht was not collapsing from a single catastrophic blow, but rather fragmenting through accumulated defeats, attrition, and the simple reality that they could not match Soviet firepower or numbers. Officers who might have commanded thousands now oversaw hundreds. Colonels led companies. What remained was a skeleton force defending a dying regime. The Chancellery district became the focus of convergence. Soviet forces approached from multiple directions, tightening the noose. The Second Belarusian Front pressed from the north, the First Belarusian Front from the east, and the First Ukrainian Front from the south. German forces found themselves compressed into smaller and smaller sectors. The bunker complex, which had seemed like a fortress when first constructed, began to feel like a tomb. Hitler's situation, already dire, became psychologically unbearable. Reports came down that the Soviets had reached the Potsdamer Platz, a major intersection just blocks away. Then that they had captured the Anhalter Bahnhof railway station. Then that they were advancing into the Tiergarten, the massive park that bordered the government district. Each advance was measured in meters sometimes, in hours of fighting often, but it was always forward, always closer. German military intelligence, what remained of it, provided increasingly accurate estimates of Soviet positions. The bunker's occupants read these reports like men reading their own death sentences, which, of course, they were. the destruction of the city's infrastructure accelerated. As Soviet forces advanced, Hitler's regime issued orders for demolition. Bridges were to be destroyed, water mains cut, electrical systems sabotaged. Anything that might be useful to the occupiers was to be rendered unusable. These orders, issued from a bunker so disconnected from reality that it might as well have been on another planet, resulted in the deaths of thousands of trapped civilians and the destruction of what little remained of essential services. People in cellars, already starving and living in filth, now faced the prospect of their water being cut off, of their buildings being demolished around them, of being literally buried alive by regime orders. The regime's final act toward the German people was sabotage. The city that had been promised glory now received only ashes. The infrastructure of daily life, water, gas, electricity, transport, ceased to exist. What had taken years to build was ordered destroyed in days by a leadership that seemed to believe that if they could not rule Berlin, no one would. The symbolic weight of this destruction was immense. It represented the regime's contempt for its own population, its refusal to accept any outcome except total victory or total annihilation. Within the bunker, Hitler's mental state continued its descent into fantasy and paranoia. He had stopped appearing in public, stopped even appearing on the telephone to issue orders. Instead, his wishes were conveyed through intermediaries, through Martin Bormann, through General Hans Krebs, through whoever happened to be near him at any given moment. Some of the orders were nonsensical. Armies that no longer existed were to attack positions that could not be reached. Some were vengeful. Officers who expressed doubts about victory were shot or hanged. Some were simply mad. Elaborate plans for defense that bore no relationship to the military situation, that required resources that did not exist, and troops that had been dead for weeks. The officers around him tried to maintain a veneer of order and function, but the system was breaking down. Communication with the outside world became increasingly difficult. Messages took hours to deliver. Information that might have been relevant became old and useless by the time it reached the bunker. Reality and the bunker's perception of reality had diverged so completely that they might have been describing different wars on different planets. The regime was strangling itself. The speed of Soviet advance into central Berlin should have been faster, but urban combat, for all its advantages to the defender, was still grinding and costly. Soviet soldiers died in large numbers. They died clearing buildings, room by room, floor by floor. They died in sniper fire from rubble piles and upper-story windows. They died in ambushes and counterattacks. They died in accidents and from friendly fire. The Soviet casualty rate in Berlin was staggering. Tens of thousands of soldiers killed and wounded for every district captured, for every block secured. Marshal Zhukov, observing the slow progress, pushed harder, committed more reserves, demanded faster advances. The Soviets had lost more than 27 million people in the war against Germany. They were not in the mood for a prolonged siege. The momentum had to be maintained. The enemy had to be crushed before he could organize any further resistance. But momentum in urban combat is itself a casualty. Progress measured in kilometers and hours became progress measured in meters and days. By late April, Soviet forces had secured the eastern and northern portions of central Berlin, had pushed into the Tiergarten, and had begun to tighten their grip on the government district. But the final breakthrough, the assault on the Chancellery itself, remained ahead of them. German forces in the center of the city, particularly units of the SS and die-hard Wehrmacht elements, continued to resist with fanatical intensity. These were soldiers who understood that surrender meant Soviet captivity, which, given what Soviet soldiers had suffered at German hands, meant death or worse. The SS men in particular, having committed atrocities that they knew would be answered, had no illusions about their fate. They fought with the desperation of the doomed, knowing that every hour bought might be an hour they could hide, escape, or simply continue to exist. Their tactical skill, honed by years of warfare, made them dangerous opponents even as their numbers dwindled. But against the weight of Soviet artillery and the relentless advance of fresh divisions, they could only delay, not prevent. The psychological weight of fighting in the capital was immense. German defenders could see above ground that their world was burning. They could hear the roar of Soviet engines approaching. They knew from spotter reports that the Chancellery, the seat of Hitler's power, was in the crosshairs. Some continued to fight because they were ordered to. Some continued because they believed in the cause, even as it crumbled around them. Some continued simply because they did not know what else to do, because the alternative, surrender, seemed even more terrible. The civilian toll continued to mount with each advance. Soviet soldiers, having been brutalized by 4 years of warfare, sometimes responded to resistance with savagery. Entire blocks were burned out because snipers had fired from buildings. Civilians suspected of assisting German defenders were killed. Women and children, caught in the crossfire, died in apartment buildings and cellars. The distinction between combatant and civilian blurred in the rubble. A person sheltering in a building from which Germans were firing became, in the eyes of advancing Soviet troops, part of the resistance. Hospitals filled beyond capacity with wounded from both sides. The city's medical system, already broken by weeks of bombing and artillery, completely collapsed. Doctors performed operations without anesthesia. Nurses worked until they collapsed from exhaustion. The morgues, the few places still functioning to manage the dead, simply stopped trying to keep track. Bodies were buried in mass graves. Some were simply left in the rubble. By late April, Berlin had ceased to function as a city in any meaningful sense. It was a battlefield, and everything in it was either a combatant or potential cover for combatants. Hitler's isolation became nearly complete. News from the outside world reached him hours or days late. Senior commanders were reluctant to tell him the truth, so he was fed a mixture of half-truths and outright deceptions designed to spare him further mental anguish. But Hitler needed no news to understand that the end was approaching. The very fact that he remained in the bunker, that he no longer appeared, that his orders went unquestioningly unexecuted by commanders in the field, all of this told him what his mind was not yet ready to accept. The fall of Berlin was happening not to distant armies but to him personally. The Red Army was not advancing toward an abstract location, but toward his bunker, toward the concrete and steel that separated him from millions of Soviet soldiers who wanted him dead. The isolation of command had transformed into the isolation of a condemned man awaiting execution. And in that bunker, surrounded by those who depended on him and those who hated him, surrounded by those who would betray him and those who remained loyal to the end, Hitler waited for the final moment. As April moved toward its end, the Chancellery itself became besieged. German defenders held the building, held the bunker entrance, held the immediate surroundings, but they held them only because the Soviets had not yet committed the final assault. Preparations were being made. Soviet commanders were gathering forces, planning the breakthrough that would end it all. The end of Berlin was not yet at hand, but it was visible on the horizon. The ring had been tightened, the center was failing, and soon, very soon, what had begun on the 16th of April, the assault on the capital, would culminate in the capture of the bunker and the death of the man who had started it all. In the bunker beneath the Chancellery, time had become meaningless. Clocks measured hours that bore no relation to the world above. where Soviet artillery continued its relentless work of destruction. The Führerbunker was a sealed tomb of reinforced concrete and steel, sunk deep enough to muffle the explosions that shook Berlin's streets, but not so deep that the occupants could escape the knowledge of what was happening. The walls themselves seemed to press inward with each passing hour. Hitler, now confined almost entirely to this underground labyrinth, had surrendered what remained of his physical presence to the bunker's artificial existence. His generals came and went through its narrow corridors, bringing reports of collapsing fronts and impossible situations. None of them dared tell him the complete truth. The Führer's mental state had deteriorated to a point beyond recovery. His hands trembled. His voice, when he spoke, alternated between whispers and sudden outbursts of rage. Those who witnessed him in these final days described a man barely recognizable, gaunt, paranoid, living entirely within a fantasy constructed from denial and will. Yet within this deteriorating mind, decisions were still being made that sent men to their deaths. Orders continued to flow from the bunker to units that no longer existed, to commanders who had already been killed, to phantom armies that existed only in maps and in Hitler's imagination. The machinery of command had become a grotesque pantomime, with everyone inside the bunker playing along because the alternative was unthinkable. On the 29th of April, Hitler summoned his inner circle for what would be called his political testament. He sat at a small table, dictating to his adjutant while those closest to him listened. Goebbels, Bormann, several military officers. His voice grew stronger as he spoke, as if the act of creating this final statement animated him with a terrible purpose. He blamed the Jews for starting the war. He blamed the failure of the generals. He blamed everyone and everything except himself. He appointed Karl Dönitz as his successor, a choice that baffled many in the bunker, as Dönitz commanded naval forces in a nation that no longer had a meaningful navy. But the logic was internal, comprehensible only to Hitler's twisted reasoning. This testament was not for the present, it was for history, or so he believed. He wanted his words preserved, his version of events recorded, even as the building above him burned. Yet while Hitler dictated his self-justifications, another process was unfolding within the bunker's walls. The paranoia that had always been a feature of the Nazi regime had metastasized into something truly pathological. Hitler became convinced that traitors surrounded him, that generals were plotting his overthrow, that betrayal lurked in every shadow. The distinction between those who disagreed with him and those who were actively conspiring against him had dissolved entirely in his mind. Orders went out for the arrest and execution of officers accused of defeatism or disloyalty. Himmler and Göring, two of the regime's most senior figures, were denounced as traitors and stripped of their positions. The regime began eating itself with a desperation that matched its military collapse. Subordinates who had spent years fighting for the Nazi cause now became targets for suspicion and elimination. The execution orders that emanated from the bunker in these final days took on a surreal quality. Hitler ordered the shooting of a general who had discussed surrender possibilities. He ordered the execution of an intelligence officer for failing to prevent Soviet advances with his analyses. He ordered the destruction of records that might implicate him in atrocities. These executions, carried out in the bunker or in buildings nearby, served no military purpose. The soldiers involved in carrying out these orders understood this perfectly well, yet they obeyed. The machinery of obedience, wound so tightly for more than a decade, continued turning even as the entire structure it was meant to serve crumbled around it. Fear and inertia proved stronger than the simple refusal to kill a fellow officer. In the operations room, The maps displayed an apocalypse. Soviet forces now controlled territory that had been marked as German-held just days before. The red pencil lines that marked Soviet positions advanced almost daily, and the gaps in German defensive lines grew wider with each passing 24 hours. Officers brought these maps to Hitler's attention, expecting orders. What they received instead were directives to defend terrain that Soviet troops had already overrun. He ordered counterattacks by divisions that had been destroyed weeks earlier. He demanded the reinforcement of fronts that no longer existed as cohesive entities. The disconnect between the world Hitler perceived and the world that actually existed had become total. Yet the military hierarchy, trained to obey, transmitted these orders down the chain of command, knowing full well that their execution was impossible. The question of the city itself haunted these final discussions in the bunker. Hitler had always viewed Berlin with complicated emotions. It was the capital of his Reich, the symbol of his power, but it was also, in some sense, a place that had never fully embraced him. Now, with Soviet forces pushing into the city's outskirts, the question arose of what would become of Berlin if it was captured intact. Hitler's answer was stark and apocalyptic. He ordered the destruction of Berlin's infrastructure, its power stations, its bridges, its water supply systems. The city that had been the heart of the Third Reich was to be reduced to rubble rather than allowed to fall into Soviet hands. The orders were issued in the name of preventing the city from becoming a Soviet stronghold, but the true motivation ran deeper. If he could not rule Berlin, then no one would possess it as a functioning city. These scorched earth orders created a crisis of conscience among some officers. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, argued passionately against the destruction of Berlin's infrastructure. Such devastation, he insisted, would serve no military purpose and would only compound the suffering of the civilian population already enduring bombardment and siege conditions. He pleaded with Hitler to reconsider. The conversation between them, reconstructed from accounts by those present, revealed the depths of the divide between those still capable of rational thought and a leader utterly consumed by nihilism. Hitler listened, but was unmoved. The orders stood. Berlin would be destroyed. In the end, logistics and the confusion of the final collapse prevented the complete execution of these orders, but the intent was clear. The regime preferred apocalypse to surrender. The bunker had become a pressure cooker of conflicting emotions and desires. Some within the inner circle had already made arrangements for their escape. Others seemed resigned to death. Goebbels and his wife had moved into the bunker with their 6 children, and there was a grim understanding among the staff about what that meant. They would not be leaving. They had staked everything on the Nazi cause, and now they faced the consequences. Goebbels, always one of the regime's most fanatical ideologues, moved through the bunker like a ghost, sometimes speaking in almost philosophical terms about the nobility of fighting to the last, at other times breaking down into despair. His presence was a constant reminder that for some within the bunker, surrender was genuinely unthinkable, not as a strategic option, but as a spiritual impossibility. The issue of what to do with prominent prisoners within the bunker also occupied Hitler's attention. The regime had taken various high-ranking opponents of the war captive, keeping them as potential bargaining chips or simply as prisoners of value. As Soviet forces closed in, Hitler issued orders regarding their execution. He would not allow the Red Army to capture these individuals, either because he feared they would be turned against him, or simply because he was determined that nothing of value would fall into Soviet hands. These orders were carried out, adding to the catalogue of killings that accompanied the regime's final dissolution. The Führerbunker became not only a command center, but also a place of execution, where the last remaining hierarchy of the Third Reich destroyed what remained of itself. Messages from the outside world continued to reach the bunker, growing increasingly desperate and chaotic. Officers on the various fronts radioed status updates that were met with disbelief or fury. A general reported that his division had been forced to retreat. Hitler's response was to order his execution for cowardice. Another commander sent word that Soviet forces had achieved a breakthrough. The response was an order to counterattack, with forces that existed only on paper. The system had broken down completely, yet its outward forms persisted. Officers continued to report to the bunker. The bunker continued to issue orders. The tragic absurdity of the situation would have been comical if the consequences were not so catastrophic. The final testament that Hitler had dictated found its way into a protective case, eventually carried out of the bunker by an adjutant determined that the Führer's words would survive, even if he would not. This document, preserved with care while Berlin burned above, represented the last effort of the Nazi regime to control its own narrative, to ensure that even in defeat, its version of history would be recorded. Hitler did not know that he would not survive to see this testament read to the world. Or perhaps he did know, and that knowledge only increased his determination to ensure that his words would outlive him. The act of creating this final statement seemed to give him a sense of purpose in these last hours, a belief that he was at least accomplishing something, even as everything else collapsed. The regime that had once seemed so powerful, so permanent, so assured of its 1,000-year future, was now confined to a bunker, issuing orders to phantoms, executing its own members, and destroying the very symbols of its triumph. The distance between the reality of absolute military defeat and the bunker's continued insistence on imaginary victories had become unbridgeable. No one inside the Führerbunker harbored genuine hope any longer, yet the machinery of the regime continued to turn. Men still saluted, officers still transmitted orders, the hierarchy still functioned, even as it consumed itself. In these final measures, the true nature of the Nazi system revealed itself, not as a political movement or a military force, but as a self-perpetuating structure of obedience that could only end when physically destroyed. The bunker walls held, but reality was seeping in through every crack. In the depths of the Reich Chancellery, where electric lights flickered against thick concrete walls, the final hours of the Third Reich unfolded not on a battlefield or in a great hall, but in a cramped underground labyrinth built to withstand the end of the world. The bunker complex, known as the Führer headquarters, had become a tomb of delusion as Soviet artillery shook the earth above and the smell of smoke filtered through the ventilation system. Adolf Hitler, once the master of continental Europe, now sat in a small map room surrounded by diminishing advisors, receiving hourly reports of military disasters that had long since become foregone conclusions. Outside, the Red Army had smashed through Berlin's final defensive lines and was systematically grinding toward the government district, street by street, building by building, erasing the Nazi capital piece by piece. Inside, Hitler lived in a perpetual state of denial, alternating between rage at perceived betrayals and moments of catatonic resignation. The men around him, field marshals, generals and bureaucrats, understood with absolute clarity that the war was lost, that Germany had been defeated, and that their leader had chosen to fight to annihilation rather than accept the inevitable. Yet no one dared speak this truth directly to Hitler's face. The cult of personality that had sustained the regime through 5 years of total war now became a prison for everyone trapped beneath the rubble. The morning of the 30th of April, arrived like any other in the bunker. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere. Messengers brought fresh reports that Soviet forces had been spotted less than 2 kilometers away, their T-34 tanks already entering the northern reaches of the government district. The sound of Soviet mortars and small arms fire now mixed with the constant rumble of distant artillery. Hitler convened his final military briefing, and the participants witnessed a man fractured between two realities. In one moment, he discussed dispatching relief divisions that did not exist to positions on maps that bore no relation to actual troop dispositions. In the next, he lapsed into a kind of philosophical resignation, speaking of the end of history and the defeat of Aryanism as though observing someone else's tragedy. General Helmuth Weidling, the commandant of Berlin, tried once more to impress upon Hitler the absolute necessity of surrender or evacuation. Weidling explained that his remaining forces could hold the government district perhaps one more day, perhaps two if fortune favored them, but no more than that. Hitler's response was to reject the premise entirely. He would not leave Berlin alive, he announced, and he would not surrender. This was the final word. From this moment forward, all other decisions flowed inexorably toward their conclusion. Throughout the morning, Hitler's personal staff began their own preparations for the end, each moving through their assigned tasks as though performing a ritual whose meaning they no longer questioned. Hitler's valet and personal adjutants tidied his quarters and prepared his personal effects with the meticulous care of men performing last rites. Conversations in the bunker took on a strange quality of finality. People spoke of the future as a thing that simply would not contain them. Some senior staff members attempted to negotiate their own fates, trying to arrange for safe passage or surrender to the Western Allies rather than the Soviets, whose reputation for brutality toward the German officer corps was well earned. Eva Braun, Hitler's companion of many years, had arrived in the bunker only days earlier, refusing to abandon him despite her sister's pleas. Now she occupied the adjoining quarters, moving quietly through the cramped spaces of Hitler's private chambers. The symbolism of her presence was not lost on anyone in the bunker. Eva's refusal to leave was seen as an unspoken confirmation that Hitler truly intended to end his life. She had made this choice with her eyes open. In mid-morning, Hitler asked to speak with Eva privately, and they withdrew to his chambers for several hours. When they emerged, Eva wore a blue silk dress and had arranged her hair with care. She did not smile, but her expression had acquired a kind of peace, as though a decision made in common had lifted an unbearable weight. Hitler then summoned Walter Wagner, a local party official who had been retained in the bunker for administrative purposes, and asked if he could perform a marriage ceremony. The bureaucratic machinery of the Reich, even in its final hours, demanded that Hitler's union with Eva Braun be formalized before witnesses and according to procedure. Wagner, understanding the symbolic and practical weight of the request, assembled the necessary documents despite the shells falling outside and the absence of normal legal frameworks. The ceremony took place in the late morning in a small conference room near Hitler's quarters, attended by Hitler's valet, his adjutants, Eva's sister, and a handful of the bunker's remaining staff. The exchange of vows was swift and formulaic, stripped of all ceremony by the grinding reality of their circumstances. Yet for those present, the moment carried an almost unbearable weight. Here was the dictator who had reshaped Europe, who had plunged the continent into darkness, exchanging vows with a woman he had kept hidden from public view for over a decade. Some observers noticed that Hitler seemed more animated during these moments than he had appeared in days, as though this final assertion of control over his personal life had temporarily restored something in him. After the ceremony, a small reception was held in Hitler's quarters. Champagne was produced from somewhere in the bunker's stores, and a brief attempt at normalcy was made before the sounds of combat and the weight of coming death reasserted themselves. Eva Hitler, as she now was, spent the afternoon burning documents and writing final letters to her family, her handwriting steady despite circumstances that would have reduced most people to incoherence. In the early afternoon, Hitler called General Hans Krebs, the Wehrmacht Chief of Staff, and asked him to attempt one final contact with Soviet command to arrange a ceasefire or evacuation. This request revealed the final depths of Hitler's disconnect from reality. The idea that the Soviet Union, standing at the threshold of total victory in Berlin, would negotiate anything whatsoever with the regime they had sworn to destroy. Krebs attempted the mission anyway, partly out of duty and partly out of a desperate hope that even at this final hour something might change. He made contact with Soviet generals through intermediaries and learned what everyone already knew: there would be no negotiations, no ceasefires, no honorable terms. The Red Army would take Berlin completely, capture its leaders alive or dead, and impose unconditional surrender upon whatever remained of German resistance. When Krebs returned to the bunker with this answer, he delivered it knowing full well that he was delivering the final confirmation of doom. Hitler received the news with apparent calm, though his hands trembled noticeably as he reviewed the written report. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Hitler made a series of decisions in rapid succession that sealed the immediate fates of those around him. First, he summoned Goebbels, his propaganda minister, and confirmed that Goebbels's family would be permitted to remain with him in the bunker until the end. This was a remarkable expression of favor. It meant that children would die in the bunker, but it also meant that Hitler was offering his trusted follower the chance to control his own family's fate, rather than allowing them to fall into Soviet hands. Goebbels accepted immediately, understanding both what he was being offered and what it meant. As the afternoon wore on, Hitler's decision solidified into an almost crystalline certainty. He would die. Eva would die with him. The Goebbels family would follow, and those loyal to him to the very end would have the opportunity to follow as well. Hitler dictated his final political proof of a typist, a rambling document that blamed the war on international Jewry, praised his own leadership, and designated successors for a regime that would cease to exist within hours. The testament was vintage Hitler, absolute in its conviction, divorced from any acknowledgement of military reality, filled with conspiracy theories and historical revisionism. Yet it was also, in its way, the capstone of his worldview. To the very end, he could not admit that he had been wrong, that his ideology was bankrupt, or that his decisions had led Germany to destruction. Instead, he blamed others, praised himself, and retreated into the refuge of his own certainty. Copies of the testament were prepared for sending to the outside world, a final attempt to ensure that his version of events would be recorded for posterity. Staff members moved through the bunker, distributing cyanide capsules and cyanide-laced bullets to those who wished to have them, a grim acknowledgement of what was coming. Some people in the bunker chose to accept these means of suicide, others declined. The atmosphere had become almost dreamlike. Some people moved about their routines as though nothing were happening, while others sat in stunned silence, waiting. As evening approached, the sounds of combat grew louder and more constant. Soviet assault troops were now only several hundred meters away, their presence felt rather than directly observed by those in the bunker. Hitler summoned those staff members who had remained with him to say goodbye. One by one, they came to his quarters to shake his hand. Men who had served him for years, men who had benefited from proximity to power, men who were now paying the price for their loyalty, with their lives or their freedom. Some wept quietly, others maintained rigid composure. Hitler spoke to each briefly, his remarks varying from appreciation to warnings about the coming Soviet occupation. To some, he offered cyanide or the promise of a bullet. To others, he offered only the acknowledgement that they had done their duty. These conversations had an almost surreal quality. They were goodbyes exchanged in the shroud of impending collapse, benedictions offered by a man whose authority over anything had become purely psychological. By late evening, most of the bunker's staff had either fled through the remaining escape routes or resigned themselves to waiting. The crowds that had filled the corridor just hours earlier thinned to a few dedicated followers, household staff, and those too damaged or too loyal to leave. Around 8:30 in the evening, Hitler and Eva withdrew to his private quarters for the last time. They had spent much of the day in these rooms, and now they would make their final preparations. Some of those outside reported hearing Hitler and Eva speaking quietly, though their words were inaudible. A few people heard Eva laughing at some comment Hitler had made, a sound so unexpected in the circumstances that it shocked those who heard it. The exact moments of what followed are shrouded in incomplete testimony, as the two people who could have provided definitive accounts were no longer alive to do so. What is established is that shortly after 9 o'clock, a gunshot echoed through Hitler's quarters, followed moments later by what several witnesses described as a second sound. Whether the second sound was another gunshot, the report of Eva's cyanide capsule, or something else entirely remains disputed. What happened next is clearer. Hitler's valet and several adjutants entered the quarters and found Hitler and Eva dead. Hitler lay slumped in his chair, a pistol at his feet. Eva sat beside him, her hand on his arm. A smell of bitter almonds, the characteristic odor of cyanide, hung in the air, suggesting that Eva had used the cyanide capsule while Hitler had used the gun, or that both had attempted both methods. The forms that lay before them were then carried out of the bunker by Hitler's staff, placed in a shell crater outside the chancellery, covered with gasoline, and set alight. The flames